Chapter 974. The wind was tainted with the smell of smoke, and the flames seemed to still be lingering in the sky. The torn clouds were like burning cotton, scattered in the sky. Behind the clouds, there was a layer of ominous golden light that shot out in all directions. Tolman's silver hair shone in the sun. He smiled and said, "They didn't want to hide it at first, but you know, this is a bad habit of wizards. They like to play word games, play tricks, and enjoy it. Because it shows that they are far smarter than mortals. Unfortunately, no one wants to be a fool, so I'm in a particularly bad mood now. Don't worry, you can go and find trouble with them. William and I will support you." To be honest, Brando had a much worse temper than you did back then. In this regard, you are far inferior to your grandfather, Brando. Brendel was not moved by his words. "Lord Tolman, what role did the Bugas play in His Majesty and the Sword of the Dragon? And what exactly are you planning to do?" The light brown eyes reflected the silvery shadows of the sails. The floating fleet was like a fish in the air, shuttling back and forth in the airport. At least one thing that the port officials of the cruise people did not misjudge was that Lone Port could not withstand such a huge fleet. It was conceivable that the port would not be able to restore its former glory for a long time after the war. But this was a problem that only the locals needed to worry about. At least for now, even Earl Alcorn himself was not in the mood to think about it. Tolman was silent for a moment. "You guessed right," he replied. "It's a long story. The wizards did not play a glorious role back then, but it all started with the great battle in the Alkash Mountains." Tolman raised his hand and drew a silver rune, Jazit, which meant night in the rune. A transparent ripple shrouded the top of the two men's heads, isolating the sound around them. "I won't repeat the process of that battle. I'm sure you've heard countless versions of it, but the story later was very different from the one circulating outside. The two sides of the battle found something in Alcala. It's related to the Dark Dragon." Tolman was not surprised that Brando would guess this. He nodded and said, "In fact, what they found was the battlefield of the final battle." The battlefield of the final battle. Only the dragon and Kjuvel, the Silver Elves, participated in the final battle. So the battlefield was really in Alcala. Brando was finally a little moved. "You know about the final battle?" "I know a little. The four sages defeated the Dark Dragon in the final battle. It is said that there are countless secrets sealed in that battlefield." Brendel was more familiar with the history of the War of the Planeswalkers. This history came from Elaine's mouth, and it was still vivid in his mind. There are no records of the final battle after the War of the Holy Saints. It was as if it had mysteriously disappeared. The only people who knew about it were the Silver Elves who retreated into the mountains, the dragons no longer appeared on the earth, and the wizards, the Bugas. He raised his head and looked at Tolman. "The Silver Union monitors everything that happens on the ground. It's hard to believe that the mortals were able to get close to Alcra and find the final battlefield without the permission of a certain faction." Tolman looked at Brando with a complicated expression. "The four sages defeated the Dark Dragon. There were countless secrets behind it. In order to keep these secrets, the only two people who participated in the battle, the Silver Elves and the dragons, had retreated from the world." "How do you know these secrets, little one?" "Through some clues of legend and speculation, I have some experience that you can't imagine, just like when I reappeared as a Highland Knight." Brando replied half-truthfully. "I know more than the Bugas think." "I can see that." Tolman sighed. His wise eyes swept across Brando's face. Darius' grandson looked very similar to him when he was young. This made Tolman feel as if he saw that person appear in front of him again. Unfortunately, the life of a mortal was too short. He seemed to recall the past when he was young in Erewhon. Now it seems that William's evaluation of you is the most pertinent. Others still see you in the shadow of Darius, but you have already walked out of it. I'm not the only one who has walked out of it, Brando thought. It was more like a coincidence. When Sophie's extraordinary soul appeared with the mentality of the whole world, the fusion of their souls was like an opportunity for them to help each other out of the shadow of the past. After the dream under the golden tree, he was no longer the young man who could only hesitate in front of the sword of the past. William admires you. He and I don't agree with the council's plan, but we are happy to see it happen. The old man thinks that you can do more. On this point, I'm not as confident as he is. But I have to admit, until today, when I meet you again, I have to say that I've probably made a rare mistake and made a bet that I would lose. Since you don't agree, why are you happy to see it happen? Because William believes that you have abilities that surpass others. You have experiences that are different from others. You can do things that others can't. There are some things, these things are things that he, and His Excellency the late Emperor could not accomplish, but William believes that you might be able to do it. What do I do to deserve it? Brando was slightly stunned, and then his heart skipped a beat. There seemed to be a hidden meaning in this evaluation. What did the different experiences from others mean? Did it mean that the other party had seen something? It sounded a little unbelievable, but for William Pist, who stood at the peak of power and one of the few who could use magic to see the future, it did not seem to be absolutely impossible. But what does this have to do with King Eric? Brando frowned, faintly feeling that he had grasped something. But he was still in a misty maze, and could only occasionally see a corner of the truth. Do you want me to be your agent and go to war with the Empire? He suddenly remembered what the Wind Elves had done in the past. At that time, the Delilah dynasty of the Elves had made such a promise to King Eric. The Bugis had sent a fleet with great fanfare. Did they want to repeat the story of the previous dynasty? You're thinking too much, little one. Am I not? You can rest assured. Going to war with the Empire will do us no good, nor is it necessary. There must be a reason for doing so. I've already mentioned the reason earlier. So, it's still related to the Great Battle of Alcala. Tolman nodded slowly. Yes, our topic is a little off topic. That great battle is the main topic. Brando glanced around. Tolman's enchantment spell still separated the inside and outside world, completely isolating sound. He suddenly felt a little funny for being so paranoid. How could the spell of the master of the Mithril Fortress fail in advance? He had a faint feeling that the following conversation might not be so simple. You haven't answered my question, Lord Tolman. About that question, I can only say that you're half right. Half. Because no one has ever deliberately done anything to cover up the battlefield of the final battle. The space in the Alcala area is not stable. That place disappeared without a trace after the final battle. It fell into the void, or was swallowed by the sea of magic. The entire space was swallowed by the noisy energy. After that, there were several continuous earthquakes in the Al-Kash Mountains. After that, the topography of the entire area had been completely changed. No one knows where the battlefield was buried. Disappeared. This answer was also beyond Brando's expectations. Not all. That was not an ordinary earthquake. It was a spatial turbulence formed after the stable laws and order were destroyed. The chaotic laws created a strange area in Alcala. Common sense does not apply there. In fact, for thousands of years, the battlefield of the final battle had appeared several times before the eyes of the world. It was like a ghost, suddenly appearing and disappearing without a trace. Once, it was discovered by an exiled Myrna clan. Another time, a descendant of ancient dwarves broke into this area. Tolman replied slowly. His voice did not fluctuate, but the things he described were very strange. After that, it flashed a few times, but it was not known to the world. In order to monitor its traces, the Bugis built countless observation points in this rift zone. Wait, you're talking about this rift zone? Are there other rift zones? Of course, our world is a whole. Once a crack appears in the laws of Tiamat, there is bound to be a chain reaction. In fact, this rift zone points to an area in Anzaruta to the south. Some strange things often happen there, and a large black forest is born there. Further south is the loop of trade winds, and north is the Great Glacier, forming a standard arc. This line is too long, even with the ability of the Bugas, they could not observe its end point. We can only speculate that if this circle has a center, it should be on the Great Plains in the east. Before the Age of Chaos, the people of gold and silver wandered in the wilderness full of thorns, the Great Plains that only existed in legends and had never been seen before. In addition, outside this main rift zone, there are some smaller rifts, such as the one you are familiar with, the Deadly Frost Forest. Brando was silent for a long time. Even if he counted his experience in the game, this was the first time he had heard such sensational news. If the respected scholar did not lie to him, this information had vaguely indicated something, that is, the legends that only existed in the background in the game were likely to be true. And Brando already knew that Tolman might not be lying, because the other party did not need to use such an obvious lie that would be exposed. Besides, some of his experiences had vaguely confirmed some of the content. Almost immediately, he subconsciously thought of an even more creepy thing. In the game, players had studied the whereabouts of the unforgettable unnamed ones in the Deadly Frost Forest. Those who had lost their memories, identities, and even themselves, existences between humans and souls. They always lined up in long lines and moved forward in the forest, luring more ignorant souls to join them. These unnamed ones would enter the Sea of Dim Light at a coast north of the Deadly Frost Forest. The direction they were moving in seemed to always be a huge arc tangent to the north coast of Erewhon. Players had racked their brains to study this enigmatic route, but in the end, it was all to no avail. They could only attribute it to the game designer's bad taste. However, at this moment, a new possibility uncontrollably appeared in Brando's mind. Those unnamed ones were moving forward along the rift zone mentioned by Tolman. But what kind of power, what reason drove them to do such a thing? What made these people lose their way? Brando could not help but shudder at the thought of those pale-skinned, empty-eyed, and bewildered trekkers. He suddenly remembered Viscount Terst, whom he had met in Bragg's. The people who took him away might have been the same group of people. What did that guy want to tell him? Unfortunately, he did not understand the situation at that time and missed the opportunity in vain. After a while, Brando forced himself to throw these thoughts out of his mind and reluctantly digested the news. He looked up at Tolman, and his forehead was slightly sweaty. This was just the beginning, so, the two sides of the battle in the Alkash Mountains entered the final battlefield by mistake. It's still half of it. We did enter the battlefield of the final battle by mistake, or rather, it appeared before us like a ghost. At that time, it was your grandfather who commanded the allied forces of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. As his deputy, I immediately felt the seriousness of the problem, and our opponents, the Wind Elves, had no lack of capable people. We quickly decided to call a truce and planned to withdraw from the battlefield under the coordination of the Buga envoys. Tolman replied slowly, as if recalling the situation of that day. Brando could imagine an ancient battlefield, quietly appearing between two armies in the fog. What a strange scene it was. What happened after that? He asked. He understood that if the two sides involved in the war had peacefully withdrawn from the battlefield as Tolman said, there would not have been so much later. We made a mistake. In fact, it was an oversight. Oversight. You said before that the mortals could get close to Alkra and find the final battlefield, they must have been instructed by one side. I said you guessed half of it right. And the other half is, it was true. But the ones who did it secretly were not the Bugas. It was a dragon. Dragon? Brando was taken aback. Tolman raised his head and looked at the sky. Just like the Myurnas, dragons have the blood of gold flowing in their veins. In the War of the Holy Saints, not all dragons stood on the side of the four sages. You should know this, right? Brando knew this. The dragons were still divided into good and evil, and the source came from the break in the era of the War of the Holy Saints. But no one knew the reason why the dragons would fight side by side with the mortals, just like how few people understood the sacred covenant between the Bugis, Queevil, and the mortals. Why would the silver and gold generation give up their era and fight for the era of the mortals? Was it because of a promise by the Azure Knight, for the era of mortals in the prophecy? Not necessarily. One of the dragons was Odin, a staunch ally of the Dark Dragon. You mean the Seven Dragons King, the evil dragon Fuchsia? Yes, after the end of the War of the Holy Saints, as the loser, Fuchsia Cath was sealed under the Great Glacier by Gwyneth and Tysgras. Brendel knew these two famous names. The former was the previous generation's Dragon King, Gwyneth, who was almost a god, the overlord of the sky. The latter was the famous Dragon of Heroes, who later played an important role in helping the humans resist the Twilight invasion during the Calamity of Wolves. But he did not say anything and continued to listen to Tolman. However, the fall of Fuchsia did not stop the ambitions of the dragons. In fact, there are still some dragons who still remember the previous era secretly operating in the human world. Due to my negligence, 3 dragons named Obsidian, Adakasha, and Gwendolyn had infiltrated the alliance. They had been lurking by the side of the previous emperor for many years. During the War of the Holy Saints, they protected the princess as the royal knight. I think you already know who they are. That princess is. Brando only felt a buzzing in his head. A few important clues were like lightning in the dark night, flashing brightly in his thoughts. In the darkness, the truth seemed to have surfaced. You guessed right. Her name is Constance, the flower of the princess, the apple of the emperor's eye. Chapter 975. Grand Emperor Grandocrates had been a playboy all his life, leaving behind countless descendants. Among these princes and princesses, only Queen Ophelia's sons and daughters had the right to inherit the throne. Among them, the Silver Queen was the third daughter of the queen, and was deeply loved by His Majesty and the queen. Under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the south of Wonde, there were countless princesses in dozens of small and large countries. If these princesses were compared to the stars in the night sky, then among the hundreds of millions of stars, there would always be 1 or 2 brightest stars, such as the Nun Princess Magadol and the Pearl of Erewhon, Griffin. But 60 years ago, the night sky belonged to only one person. That person was the Silver Princess, Constance. Constance could be said to be the kind of person who was born with a silver spoon in her mouth. As the daughter of Grand Emperor Grandocrates and Queen Ophelia, she had an incomparably noble birth. As she grew up, her beauty gradually spread beyond the empire. Even as far away as St. Tossol, where the Wind Elves lived, Fanzan in the north, and the 10 cities ruled by free mercenaries and merchants, people were talking about this cruise princess. Constance was also a seer. When she was born, she had a part of the silver bloodline. This was the origin of the title of princess. When she was a young girl, the chief court wizard of the Cruise Empire, Master Jarrett, asserted that she would become the most outstanding wizard of the empire in the future. Just like the scholar girl Shido, Constance's outstanding talent quickly attracted the attention of the Bugis. Ajani, the leader of the Wizards of the Silver Society, had taught Her Majesty the Queen when she was a girl for a long time. But just this alone was not enough to make her the successor of the empire. Don't forget that she still had 2 older brothers. Even though the eldest son of Emperor Grandocrates had been injured in the war in the north and had been suffering from constant injuries since then, he had passed away at the age of 27. However, his second son was talented and intelligent. Furthermore, he was as cultured and refined as his elder brother. Furthermore, he had the support of the Prime Minister. No matter how one looked at it, he was the best candidate for the throne. To Emperor Grantotilde, the best choice was to let his second son inherit the throne and let his youngest daughter, Constance, become a court mage or enter the Holy Cathedral of Fire. This was undoubtedly the best of both worlds for the royal family. Brando knew that there must have been some earth-shattering accidents when the Silver Queen finally took over the throne from the Emperor. These accidents obviously happened during the war in Algash. He asked, what exactly did they encounter there? What does it have to do with my grandfather? Was my grandfather's trial a cover-up? Don't worry, take your time, little guy. They passed through the fog, and guess what they saw there? Tolman looked at Brando with interest. They found the inheritance of the Dark Dragon. The inheritance of the Dark Dragon. Brando was shocked and clenched his fists guiltily. In the current world, anyone who had anything to do with the Dark Dragon was like a rat crossing the street. It was understandable just by looking at the situation of the witches. They were only suspected of having an affair with the Dark Dragon. The Myrnas, the former servants of the Dark Dragon, were even expelled from the civilized world and disappeared into the great glaciers for thousands of years. The last person in the human world who had Myrna's blood was the Great Knight dubbed of the Grecius Knight Regiment 600 years ago. He was found to have 1/4 Myrna blood and was burned at the stake. That dark era was really chilling to think about. Although it was not as strict as it was a few hundred years ago, it was impossible for the Silver Queen to inherit the throne just because she obtained the inheritance of the Dark Dragon. Not to mention the throne, it was more likely that the royal family would treat it as an unspeakable scandal and imprison her forever. However, the development of history was bizarre and contrary to common sense. At least the world now knew who the Supreme Emperor of Cruz was. It was that person's inheritance. When Constance found them, they were sealed in 2 broken crystals. 2 broken crystals? Brando's heartbeat quickened. Weren't they soul gems? Tolman nodded. There has always been a legend among the mountain people living in the Latch of Wa. It is said that before the final battle, the Dark Dragon sealed part of his soul imprint in a grey gem. This grey gem was discovered by a team of explorers in the White Mountain Creek Valley. It was called the Grey Valley Crown. After the final battle, the Grey Valley Crown was artificially divided into several pieces. The person who divided the gems was Conrad, a legendary craftsman who had 1/4 mountain folk blood. He completed the work in a valley in Walla. Many mountain people were captured and used as laborers. Most of them were killed, but there were still a few who survived. Therefore, this legend has been passed down by the survivors until now. And what Constance found was 2 of the Grey Valley Crown that was divided into 6 pieces. The Myrnas call these broken crystals soul gems. Brando stood in place and was silent for a long time before he continued to ask, and then? Tolman smiled and changed the topic. Everyone knows that the Dark Dragon Odin is the root of all evil and is a tyrant. However, the jealousy of the mortals towards the Myrnas and their coveting of the tyrant's power has never stopped. The reason why people are so keen to find the battlefield of the final battle is because legend has it that the Dark Dragon left the inheritance of the Myrnas, the only inheritance of the golden bloodline in the mortal era other than the dragons, on that battlefield. The Dark Dragon left the inheritance of the Myrnas on the battlefield of the final battle. Brando frowned. How could anyone believe such a ridiculous rumor? If Odin left the inheritance on the battlefield, how could the 4 sages be indifferent? Besides, weren't the Silver Folk also involved in the battle? You think this reason sounds ridiculous? Tolman asked Brando with a smile. Actually, it's not like that. There's a reason for this rumor to spread. For thousands of years, people have tried their best to find the glorious inheritance of the Myrnas, but to no avail. The only place left is the battlefield of the final battle. However, the 4 sages were tight-lipped about the outcome of the final battle after the War of the Holy Saints. Even the Silver Folk swore an oath according to the sacred covenant to keep a secret. In fact, everyone knows what that secret is about. The inheritance of the dark dragon is too sensitive. If people want to get it, it's difficult to bypass the justice of the war of the holy saints. But the knowledge and civilization of the Myrnas are different. Constance is the princess of the empire and naturally knows this. In fact, her goal was the latter from the beginning. If the empire can inherit the golden civilization, it will be above Saint Tassol and Fanzan, and also above the holy cathedral of fire. Constance knows very well that now that the inheritance of the dark dragon is here, the rumor is likely to be true. The inheritance of the Myrnas is also here. But she also knows that it's unrealistic for her and Gwendolyn to search the entire battlefield. Tolman paused for a moment. Of course, at that time, she didn't know the true identity of Gwendolyn and the rest. The only thing she could think of was to ask Darius and me, "Who is your grandfather?" At that time, your grandfather was the marshal of the allied forces of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and Constance was your grandfather's deputy. In fact, she was just one of them. After all, to command such a large allied force, your grandfather couldn't only have one capable subordinate. At that time, he had a few more important deputies. One of them was Marshal Darren Hill of the Antiburo Duchy, and the other was me. Darren Hill. It was the first time Brando heard of this name. However, most of the higher-ups of the Allied forces were the best and most outstanding soldiers from various countries appointed by the Holy Cathedral of Fire. This marshal was probably an incredible figure in the Antiburo Duchy back then. At the mention of this small country in the southeast of the Cruz Empire, the first thing that came to his mind was the nun princess. Thinking of Magadal's goddess-like appearance and her firm and kind heart, Brando couldn't help but fall into a trance. Such an excellent princess was naturally worthy of being pursued by the world, even the Holy Cathedral of Fire was no exception. But how many people knew that there might be an inhuman soul hidden in the princess body? He shook his head and threw this thought out of his mind. He listened to Tolman continue. After she returned to the Allied forces, the first thing she did was to order your grandfather to send an army into the final battlefield to search for the inheritance of the Myrna people. But Constance was a very shrewd woman. Even when she was still the princess of the empire, this kind of extraordinary wisdom had already emerged. She knew about my relationship with the Bugis, so she privately begged me not to reveal this secret to the Silver Society. She also understood the feelings Darius and I had for Erwin, so she made a vow that if one day the Empire obtained the inheritance of the Golden Civilization and stood at the top of the world, she would give Erwin eternal and true independence. She made a vow in the name of the Flame King Gretel, the ancestor of the Cruz people, so naturally it was true and trustworthy. That was why your grandfather and I were moved from the beginning. Speaking of this, Tolman sighed, this is because I know very well that the little princess of the empire is outstanding, rational and clear-headed. She would never covet the inheritance of the dark dragon. And the inheritance of the golden civilization is not a taboo for the Bugis. The passing of civilization is actually something we are happy to see, so I opened my mouth and agreed on your grandfather's behalf. What about my grandfather? Brando couldn't help but ask. This question made the elder of the Silver Alliance standing in front of him twitch his snow-white eyebrows. He looked at him a little strangely and replied, "Young man, your grandfather was in the prime of his life, and was also handsome and charming. His prestige in the Holy Cathedral of Fire was gradually rising. Grand Emperor Grandocrates even had the intention to let him join the empire and offered him the position of marshal. But that old man rejected him with the stubbornness and pride unique to the Erewhon people." Although he said this, the old man's wrinkled face couldn't help but flash a trace of excitement and admiration. This was his old friend, and also the backbone of the Erewhon people. However, the pride was quickly replaced by loneliness. He shook his head and said, "Since ancient times, young girls have always admired heroes in knight. And a woman as outstanding as Princess Constance would naturally have her eyes on the top of her head. In the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire, the only person who could make her look up to was probably your grandfather." Brando almost spat out a mouthful of water. He was so shocked that he couldn't help but blurt out, "You mean my grandfather and Her Majesty the Queen, she?" His words were stuck behind the word she. No matter how rich his imagination was, he couldn't believe that his grandfather almost became the man of the Silver Queen. And that woman was now the ruler of such a vast area, from the hazel highlands in the west, to the four-leaf grass in the east, to the mountains of Oman in the south, and to the Sea of Iranta in the north. She was the supreme person of the empire, the emperor of the Cruise people. Sometimes, reality was even more absurd than the most bizarre night novels, but this was too outrageous, and he could not accept it for a while. Tolman nodded solemnly. Although this relationship has never surfaced, the relationship between your grandfather and Her Highness was actually an open secret within the alliance. Thus, whether it was for public or private reasons, your grandfather had to agree to Her Highness' request. But what we didn't expect was that 2 days later, things took a turn that none of us expected. No one expected that on that night, the news quietly spread out and reached the ears of the Wind Elves and Fanzon in St. Tassol. By the time we reacted, the whole thing was a mess. In order to get ahead of us, the Fanzon and the Wind Elves disregarded the opposition of the Bugha people and took the lead in sending troops to the final battlefield. Because of this, Her Royal Highness was extremely disappointed in your grandfather. That night, the only people who knew this secret were me, your grandfather, and Gwendolen. Gwendolen and the other two were Her Royal Highness chamberlains, so they had no chance or time to spread the news. And I, who was half a silver person, had no motive to do so. So after eliminating all the possibilities, your grandfather was the biggest suspect. Brando didn't interrupt, but he also knew that if he were in that environment, the first suspect would definitely be his grandfather. If he had been in his grandfather's position, he might have also considered spreading the news. If personal feelings were excluded, for Erewhon, the best situation on the continent would be for St. Tassol, Fanzon, and the Cruise Empire to restrain each other and maintain a balance of power. This way, a small country like Erewhon would have a chance to survive. Although the Silver Queen's oath was true and trustworthy, it was only her oath after all. Not to mention that she wasn't the emperor of the empire at that time. Even if she was, what about 100 years later? So the best way was to spread the news, muddy the waters, let the Bugha people intervene, and make everyone lose their chance. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but ask, could it really be my grandfather? Of course not. Tolman shook his head decisively. Who is your grandfather? Why would he be two-faced in front of his woman? He is an indomitable hero. Even if there was a legitimate reason, he wouldn't use these schemes. But at that time, Her Royal Highness didn't listen to his explanation at all. She directly exercised the power of the Empire's princess to supervise the coalition forces, deprived your grandfather of his command, put him under house arrest, and then led the army into the final battlefield. The old man sighed. In fact, with your grandfather's prestige at the time, it was very easy to oppose Constance. Although she nominally had the hidden identity of an army supervisor, the coalition forces weren't just Cruise's people. What's more, to deprive the Marshal of the coalition forces' military power based on suspicion alone, this was unreasonable. Unfortunately, your grandfather was unwilling to fall out with Her Royal Highness, which led to the tragedy that followed. The tragedy that followed. Brando couldn't help but frown and asked cautiously. He only knew that later on, his grandfather was put on trial by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and Her Royal Highness inherited the throne not long after that. Gwendolen and the other 3 dragons were now expelled by the dragon race, banished to the underground of Jorgundy Ridge, and ordered not to step foot in Wonde. But as for what exactly happened, although there were different opinions, there was still no conclusion. It was said that his grandfather was attacked from behind when he went deep into the Al-Kash Mountains. Whether this was because of the persecution and conspiracy of the Holy Cathedral or some other reason, it was unknown. You should have guessed it. Now it seems that it was actually Gwendolen and the other 2 who spread the news. As the princess's servants, they naturally didn't have the opportunity, nor the motive and reason. But if they were dragons, their behavior is understandable. They bewitched Constance to look for the inheritance of the Myernas, but their real purpose was actually the soul gem left behind by the dark dragon. Since they had already found the fragment of the Grey Valley's crown, how could they give it up so easily? Earlier on, they were on the same side as Her Royal Highness, but now, Constance wanted to control the situation and control everything within the range that the Empire could bear. From this moment on, their goals diverged. So, Gwendolyn and the others immediately spread the news, stirring up the water first, and then waiting for an opportunity to seize the soul gem. Their purpose was naturally the legend of the return of the Dark Dragon and the Darkness prophecy. At this point, Tolman looked at Brendel with a profound gaze, causing the latter to break out in cold sweat, before he continued to narrate, "That's right. At first, their conspiracy almost succeeded. But who would have thought that the secret of the final battle was far from as simple as they thought?" His voice became a little distant, as if he was recalling everything that happened at that time. When the crews, Fanzin, and the Wind Elves all entered the fog-shrouded battlefield, something terrible happened. The soldiers lost their minds one by one, as if they were controlled by an invisible force. At first, they killed each other, until the number of people who could still maintain a clear mind became fewer and fewer. What was even more frightening was that this situation spread like a plague, and was no longer limited to within the fog. Even the Allied army stationed outside the battlefield began to be affected. Things got out of hand. The Bugas wanted to intervene, but it was already too late. And as the Bugas liaison in the Crew's alliance, I naturally knew the news immediately. At that moment, I knew that trouble was coming. There is only one possibility in this situation, and that is that there must be a huge seal on the final battlefield, and there is some kind of evil that we do not know of sealed under it. And now, someone has touched this seal. We immediately notified the headquarters of the Silver Alliance. After searching through the ancient books and the oral accounts of some of the sages who survived the War of the Holy Saints, we confirmed this news. The secret that the four sages kept to themselves in the final battle was indeed related to this seal. And as for what this seal is, even the Silver Folk did not have the slightest record of it. There was only a paragraph of text that described the situation from the side. The text was actually written in the appendix of the Sacred Covenant, and it was described as follows: I, Elroy Mithril, in the name of the Silver Folk, swear on the Sacred Covenant. Under the witness of the four sages, the Silver Folk will henceforth shoulder the responsibility of monitoring the entire world, and guard this secret until the prophecy is fulfilled. The prophecy. The prophecy was also written in the appendix, and it was described as follows: 16, the tower, the lost moon took away the light. XX, judgment, the light lost. 17, the star, the silver generation was lost on the earth, and moved forward in darkness and obscurity. 8, strength, the chance encounter between the emperor and the fool. 9, the hermit, the rusty clockwork was being reset. XXI, the world, the sword that changed fate. With half the blood of the Silver Folk flowing in his body, Tolman's memory was amazingly good, and he described the entire prophecy word for word. Brando could not help but feel a chill down his spine when he heard the entire prophecy, because he suddenly realized that he had seen this prophecy before. When he first crossed over to this world, in those consecutive dreams, he had seen the first paragraph of this prophecy more than once. What exactly is this language describing? He could not help but blurt out. But Tolman shook his head. We don't know either. Elroy was the previous leader of the Silver Society, and even he did not mention such a paragraph in the appendix, not to mention that he died in an accident in the Year of Green, so we can't ask him for confirmation. Then what is sealed under the battlefield of the final battle? It's a crystal. Tolman hesitated. Behind the fog, there is a majestic temple. According to the description, the temple is 66 feet tall, and both sides are hidden in the fog. There is no way to know how wide it is, and it seems to be the place where the final battle took place. The temple is badly damaged, and in the center of the temple, there is a huge purple crystal in the ruins. The crystal seems to have fallen from the sky, and it went straight into the solid marble floor of the temple, causing the stone slabs and soil to arch up, and half of the crystal's volume is buried underground. Anyone who gets close to the crystal will be assimilated by the crystal, and become a monster. Turn into a monster, Brendel frowned, as if he had a thought. Turn into such a monster. Tolman gently patted the back of his neck. From here on, there will be patches of crystal-like keratin growing, and then the whole person will gradually be assimilated by the crystal, turning into a half-human, half-crystal monster. At this time, he will have completely lost his mind, and become like a wild beast, fierce and bloodthirsty, and extremely hostile to the humans who were originally the same kind, or the wind elves. Crystallization disease. Brando already understood what it was, and he could not help but think of the crystallization monster he encountered in Ampere Seal. There was only one thing that could cause the crystallization disease, and that was the Somir crystal. Chapter 976. The Somir crystal was also known as the Somir ore in the game. When it was first discovered, it was thought to be a crystal ore that was rich in magic. Later on, people gradually discovered another characteristic of this crystal, the ability to crystallize. The Somir crystal had the ability to crystallize any living organism that came close to it. However, the crystallized organism did not lose its life. Instead, it was transformed into a kind of life form made up of crystals, a semi-crystallized organism. As this ability was not only effective on animals, it also had the same effect on plants. Therefore, large areas of crystal forests were often found around the Somir crystal. In fact, it was one of the reasons why crystal forests were formed. However, the assimilation effect of the Somir crystal on living organisms was a slow and gradual process. It usually took a few years or even longer to complete the process. According to Tolman's description, the soldiers of the three empires were affected by the crystallization disease after only 2 or 3 days of entering the final battlefield. Although this crystal sounded very similar to the Somir crystal that Brando had heard of before, the effect was obviously much stronger. Perhaps it was a variant of a stronger magic power, or perhaps it was something else entirely. But no matter which it was, the crystallization process should be an irreversible process. That was why he had such a headache when he faced Elaine's crystallization disease. In fact, in the game's records, there were only a few cases of crystallization disease being cured. Most of them were thanks to the miraculous abilities like the Fountain of Life or the Miracle Spell. On the battlefield of the final battle, it was obviously impossible for so many miracles to exist at the same time. There were countless soldiers on the battlefield, and in addition to the basic soldiers, there were also a large number of nobles. There was no lack of upper-class nobles among them. If these people died on the battlefield, it would be a big matter for any country at that time. Judging from Tolman's tone, when the crystallization disease spread, it was obvious that most of the people were affected. Speaking of which, it was necessary to mention the attitude of the nobles in Wone during that time. Before the Second Holy War, the nobles generally regarded participating in the war as a kind of glory. It was not because they still had the heroic spirit of their ancestors who had cut through the thorns in the wilderness. On the contrary, in the heart of the civilization, after the first generation of pioneering knight gradually faded from the view of the world, the descendants were increasingly addicted to playing and having fun. They had long lost the demeanor of their ancestors. During the War of the Holy Saints, the human nobles could easily die for a word or a promise. But today, after 1,000 years, this kind of behavior was regarded as something that only fools would do. The nobles were not afraid of war because it was not a matter of life and death for them. This was especially so for the Empire of Cruz. There were very few records of upper-class nobles dying in the war. Unless they were too unlucky to be shot by stray arrows, or died of diseases because they could not acclimatize to the climate. Even if they were captured, they would still be treated with dignity. For their enemies, hostages meant a large sum of ransom. To this day, most of the nobles still reminisced about that era. They thought that the war of that era was a classic and romantic war that combined the spirit of the knight and the virtues of kindness. Of course, this privilege was only for the nobles. For the soldiers from the lower class, the original intention of war had never changed. It was still mixed with the cold metal and the smell of death. From this, it could be seen that if hundreds or thousands of nobles died in a war, it would be a nightmare for any country of that era. Even the royal family could be torn apart by the angry family members of the deceased. One had to know what kind of power was behind the deceased. For example, Brando remembered very clearly that on the side of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, there were 3 dukes in the Cruz Empire who participated in the war. There were also a bunch of lords under them, big and small. Behind each of them was a tangled and complicated network of relationships. It was not an exaggeration to say that it included the bloodlines of the nobles in the entire empire. If these people died on the battlefield, it was very likely that an empire's princess would be implicated. The situation on the side of Saint Tassol and Fanzan was similar. If such a thing happened, it would be impossible to cover it up no matter which side it was. There was no way to cover it up at all. Thinking of this, Brando's thoughts suddenly flashed. He realized who his grandfather's scapegoat was, but this thought only flashed through his mind. He immediately shook his head. His grandfather could not bear this scapegoat at all, even if he was the commander of the allied forces of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Moreover, he also knew that although many nobles died in the Battle of Algash, it was not to the extent that it was unacceptable. At least the princess, the 3 dukes, and a few important people returned to the country intact. Could it be that the crystallization disease knew how to differentiate between high and low, and that nobles were immune to it? This kind of nonsense was obviously not worth mentioning. There was only one possibility, and that was that someone turned the tide and saved the allied forces of the 3 empires at the last moment. This would also explain why the 3 holy cathedrals stopped fighting after that, and the Second Holy War came to an end. Regarding that person, Brando already had a strong premonition in his heart. More than once, the tall figure of that person appeared in his mind. Under the blood-red setting sun of Brags, the stag forest seemed to be dyed with a layer of soft bronze color, the flowing golden river soaked the shallows, the silent old man stood quietly, thoughtfully watching his grandson practice swordsmanship. Now that Brando thought about it, his grandfather's broad shoulders and tightly pursed lips had always been guarding some unknown secret. The whispers behind that secret lingered around the old man's life, and with the arrival of the final moment, it turned into dust and was buried in the grave. And at this moment, it was finally time for this secret to be revealed. Facing Hao Ren's questioning gaze, Tolman did not keep Hao Ren in suspense and told him everything that happened at that time. The crystallization disease seemed to have spread overnight among the allied forces of the 3 empires, and countless people were infected. Although the crystallization disease was not that serious at first, under the influence of the magic of the Somir crystal, all the infected became manic and agitated, gathering together to attack each other, or attack the normal people who tried to separate them. As more and more people joined them, the situation in the Alcala area gradually became out of control. Some people fled out of fear, and among them were nobles who commanded the army, and the number of normal people gradually decreased to the point where they could barely keep themselves safe. Under the circumstances at that time, discussing how to solve the problem was already a joke. The only thing left to do was to wait for death, and the only thing left to do was to gamble. The Bugis sorcerer suggested that perhaps they could break the Somir crystal in the Holy Cathedral, or throw it into some spatial turbulence through magic. Although this may not change what had happened, at least it could stop the situation from worsening. After a few rounds of discussion, this proposal was approved by most of the remaining people, but the question was, who would do it? In the ruins of the last battle, there were countless soldiers infected by the crystallization disease wandering in the fog. Just passing through them to reach the temple was as difficult as ascending to the heavens, not to mention the dangers in the mysterious temple. It was simply impossible to predict what kind of dangers there would be. It could be said that carrying out this mission was suicide, and not everyone was willing to do it because to complete this impossible mission, it was obviously not enough to rely on the strength of a few people. What they needed was an army, and an army needed a commander. Ironically, in order to compete for the so-called inheritance of the Immerse, no one in the three empires was willing to be left behind. As soon as the news spread, most of the nobles, including the commanders of the Imperial Coalition forces, entered the fog immediately, for fear of being left behind. At this moment, none of these noble commanders came out of the fog again. And the remaining people in the coalition forces who were qualified to command the army had either fled or were unwilling to enter the fog. In the end, the Bukis found that only one person perfectly met their expectations, and that was Darius, who was under house arrest by the Silver Queen. In terms of seniority, he was originally the commander of the coalition forces on the side of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and his prestige was definitely enough. On the other hand, because of his disagreement with Constance, he escaped the disaster in the first place and was not infected by the crystallization disease. Now, all that was left was his own will. But as Brando expected, after learning the ins and outs of the whole thing, his grandfather did not say a word and took over the position of commander. This may seem inconceivable to others, but at that moment, Brando somewhat understood his grandfather. This was not only because of the pride of being a soldier, but also because in the fog, there was the woman he loved deeply. As the old man grew older, he had to succumb to time and fate, and his tall figure gradually stooped. In his silent heart, there was also a different kind of pride and passion. It was a pity that he had never seen his grandfather in that era. In Brando's memory, a vivid memory belonging to that old man seemed to gradually yellowed and faded, and then overlapped with another image. In that image, Brando saw a cloud of flags, a sea of night, and a man standing in front of the tide-like army, the marshal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and the undying ambition in his heart. That was an era that belonged to Erwin, Anson, and his two important ministers. One was in front of him, and the other was forever in his memory. Erwin in that era was far more glorious than he was now. Brando gradually became silent, just like his grandfather. He listened to Tumen talk about his grandfather's success. It was like a hero in a classical myth who survived a desperate situation and often saved the day in the most impossible situation. The people of Cruz, the people of Fanzan, and the Wind Elves finally put down their prejudice at the most critical moment and united together. Just like 1,000 years ago, they accepted the command of a human. They passed through the final battlefield filled with fog, opened a bloody path from the encirclement of the semi-crystallized creatures, and overcame the layers of illusions. It was like the ancestors who walked through the blood and thorns in the dark era to reach the Holy Cathedral with unyielding will. Your grandfather broke the crystal, and the huge crystal pillar was split into two. After it collapsed, it lost its magic. Not only did the crystallization disease stop spreading, even the crystallized human and elven soldiers gradually returned to normal, Tumen said slowly. That crystal is still in the Museum of Felon. Anram erected a wordless stone tablet for it to commemorate the heroes of the past. It's just that few people know its origin. Why a wordless stone tablet? Brando asked quietly. Sword Saint Darius, his grandfather had saved the three empires. It could be said that Kurlutz, Farnazane, and even countless nobles of the Wind Elves owed him a favor, but what he received was an unfair trial. Brendel's heart was already filled with cold murderous intent. If he found out who was behind all this, he would definitely make them regret everything they had done in the past. Because the Cardoloso family still had descendants, and because Darius' grandson's name was Brando. Unexpectedly, Tumen shook his head and said a little heavily, I know what you're thinking, little guy, but it's not what you think. It's your grandfather who took the initiative to accept the trial. Brando was stunned. Why? He couldn't help but blurt out. Because if he didn't accept the trial, the Silver Princess would die. Garden of White Roses, tap, tap. 2 crimson boots with golden roses on the tip stepped on the footboard of the carriage one after another, followed by a wave-like dark skirt. The Empress of the Empire, Constance, elegantly walked down the carriage with the help of a maid. 2 women hurriedly stepped forward and rolled up her long skirt. Her Majesty the Empress glanced around coldly. Her furrowed brows showed that the supreme ruler of a vast territory was not calm. Your Majesty. The 2 rows of maids bowed. Constance ignored them. She quickly walked past them and through the corridor. Her cold face seemed to be pregnant with a storm of anger. Bang! The golden walnut door of the sleeping chamber was pushed open. The maid's outstretched hands froze in midair. They looked at the bad-tempered Empress in shock, but the latter had already said coldly, "You may leave." The maids didn't dare to disobey her orders. A few of the noblewomen looked at each other in bewilderment, then bowed and left. The room quickly quieted down. She rejected you again. After a while, the soft voice of the Dragon Empress came from the sofa, as if the lady was there. She asked in her usual calm tone. But Constance didn't need to turn her head to know that the expensive golden camel fur sofa made by Sideris was empty. She will agree. I don't have much time left for that little mountain girl, Constance replied coldly. When the time comes, I'll let her know that I won't just speak gently. That's for sure. The wrath of a king will cause blood to flow. So, you're going to use your sword on the mountain people? No, it's the opposite. The Silver Queen sneered, I'm going to marry her to that self-righteous guy, that mountain people's prince. Anyway, he has begged me more than once to marry an imperial princess to him. Since they are of the same race, I think she will be satisfied. Constance couldn't hide the contempt in her voice when she talked about the mountain people's prince. In fact, it was an insult. After all, the country bumpkin from the mountains was always so self-righteous. In fact, no orthodox imperial nobles would associate with them. The funny thing was that he took this identity seriously, so the title of mountain people came into being. Generally speaking, as the role model of the empire and the supreme person on the throne, Constance rarely used such frivolous words. But now, she was obviously in an extreme rage. The Dragon Queen looked at her strangely from the void. She's that little guy's woman. He's that person's grandson, isn't he? You really don't care about him at all. He's that woman's grandson. Constance corrected her coldly. So, this is the jealousy between human women. The Dragon Queen's voice became a little curious. To this question, the Silver Queen had never answered. She stood silently on the spot, her eyes calm, resting on the black sandalwood desk. What are you thinking, Your Majesty? I'm thinking, if I wasn't so naive back then, maybe I would be different now, Gwendolyn. But you once had the chance to choose, Your Majesty. Constance's voice hesitated, because I don't want to lie to myself. The fleet was about to set sail. Brando slowly stepped onto the deck and looked back. On the bridge, the silver folk were entering the portal in a single file. Tolman was walking at the back. As if he felt something, he turned around and raised his head slightly. Under the shadow of the silver silk hood with silver patterns, 2 silver-gray eyes shone brightly. Between his thin lips, there was a faint mysterious smile. He took a deep breath, and could not help but gently press his hand on the side of the ship that was engraved with the relief of Leviathan. About the conversation before, it was as if in an instant, it reappeared before his eyes. I don't understand. Brando stared at the old man in front of him. His cold eyes seemed to see through him completely. It's very simple. As I said before, on the battlefield of the final battle, in the temple, that strange crystal was sealed at the beginning. But the person who sealed it was not the four sages, but the darkness dragon Odin. The first one to touch that seal was Her Majesty the Queen, whom you know well. When the seal was opened, the mystery was also revealed. The secret of the final battle of the War of the Holy Saints was displayed in front of everyone. Because I was with your grandfather at that time, I don't know what they saw, but I only know one thing. That is, the answer to this mystery is related to the agreement between the four sages and the darkness dragon Odin. So, from this, it can be inferred that a legend about a rumor for 1,000 years may be true. The old man's voice was a little hoarse. You know, the order of the mortal world and the legitimacy of the four empires are based on the righteousness of the battle of the holy saints. But in fact, there has been a saying in the past 1,000 years that the actions of the four sages in the battle of the holy saints may not be so sacred and righteous. That is to say, in this story, the darkness dragon is a tyrant, but the four sages are just usurpers. Tolman looked up and narrowed his eyes at Brando. Do you know what this means? Brando did not answer. He had actually heard of such a legend, but it was spread in the Amber Sword. There were countless legends of all kinds, and there was such a saying that for every bard, there would be an additional version of the story, so no one would delve into it. But he also understood what it meant if this was true. In the history of the replacement of human dynasties, fights for the throne and conspiracies to usurp the throne were not uncommon. But the sacred war of the holy saints was based on the covenant between the silver folk and the races of the continent. The cornerstone of the covenant was to end the dark reign of the Myrnas and fulfill the prophecy, the so-called era of mortals. This covenant was described as a sacred covenant in the Pale poem, also known as the Sacred Oath. Since it was sacred, it must first be based on justice. And this was also the basis of the legitimacy of the era of mortals. If all this was just a lie, then not only would the status of the four sages be questioned, but more importantly, it would violently impact the current world order, and the legitimacy of the four holy shrines would be gone. Once the prophecy came true, then the world would inevitably be plunged into endless disputes and wars, because no one could interpret morality and justice. Then the only stage left would be for the ambitious. Brendel shuddered at the thought. Chapter 977. This was an era that belonged to the ambitious. Opportunities and cunning conspiracies were like a raging river, sweeping from beginning to end for hundreds of years. Like an invisible feather pen writing furiously in the depths of dark thoughts, a complete story gradually took shape in Brando's mind. The latter half of the story could be foreseen. In the center of the fog-shrouded ruins of the final battle, in the dark and silent temple, it did not matter what Her Majesty the Silver Queen saw, what happened, whether it was true or false, right or wrong, it did not matter now. Its ending was already predetermined. The four holy cathedrals and the Bugis would never let this matter have any sequelae, let alone let its influence be brought out of the Alcala region. But the reason for this was not as sinister and despicable as the world thought it to be. Because the leader of the Silver Folk, the master of the Silver Lightning, Elroy, had pressed his hand on the sacred oath and made an oath to the four sages, declaring that in the next era, the Silver Folk would fulfill their duties and take on the heavy responsibility of guarding and monitoring the world. This promise, in the eyes of the people of this era, may seem inconceivable, even too childish. It was just a promise. What could it mean? The people of this era, from the nobles to the common people, believed in downright egoism. There was only naked interest between countries. Between kingdoms, between groups, it had long been a common occurrence. Conspiracies and betrayals ran rampant in the world, and this period of history was already hundreds of years old. So they could not imagine. They could not imagine that glorious era, and could not understand what a promise between the nobles was. There was an era when Elroy spoke loudly in front of the sacred covenant. Every word he said turned into silver words that were inscribed on the sacred white slate. They were like shining silver nails that were nailed into the long river of history one by one. This was not for greed, but to prove right and wrong, black and white. As the Flame King Gretel once said, this is a righteous cause, an ideal in the heart, so it is worth protecting. Everything they did was for the long-term survival of civilization and order. Therefore, for 1,000 years, the Silver Folk had promised that they would no longer intervene in mortal wars. They had built watchtowers at the borders of the civilized world that were more dazzling than the stars. Although Brando had once maliciously joked that the Bugas were monitoring the power of the mortals in the whole world, he knew in his heart that their power has long been above the peak of the world, so much so that mortals have to look up to their aloofness. Even if mortals maliciously speculate that these wizards are manipulating the direction of history behind the scenes, they have to admit, the truth is that for 1,000 years, the Silver Folk have never crossed the line drawn by Elroy. There was a maxim among the wizards of Buga: if a successor does not keep his word, it is a disservice to the noble deeds of his predecessors. In their eyes, the promises of the nobles were the most precious things in the world. Because it was too easy to destroy, once it was destroyed, it would be very difficult to find it again. William had lamented to the players more than once, the lives of mortals are too short, so they are too short-sighted, and it is easy for them to replace those noble values with immediate benefits. It is difficult for them to understand that the gains do not make up for the losses. After Tolman slowly finished the first half of the story, Brando looked up at him. He did not know if it was his imagination, but he felt that there was some deep sadness in the elder's silver eyes. He could actually understand where this sadness came from. On the battlefield ruins of the final battle, if everything that happened in that temple really proved that the four sages were wrong, or not so righteous, then it would cast a shadow over the sacred oath. If a successor does not keep his word, it is a disservice to the noble deeds of his predecessors. But what if all this was wrong from the beginning? Now there were only two choices left in front of the four holy cathedrals and the Silver Folk: either they admit the mistakes of their predecessors, and let the world undergo a thorough reform and baptism. After that, the four holy cathedrals may disappear, but at least the truth will always exist in the world. But more likely, they would let the world sink into darkness, let conspiracies and lies obscure the light of reason, and let Wone become the biggest stage for ambitious people in the next few hundred years. Or they would cover up the truth. Although it would tarnish their own hearts, the fire of civilization and order would still exist, and at least the world would not fall into a sea of fire. The War of the Holy Saints had ended 1,000 years ago, and there was no reason to let the hatred of that era continue. That would be too selfish. The four holy cathedrals chose the latter. At that time, other than the dragons and the wizard leaders of the Silver Alliance, there were also the popes and high priests of the four holy cathedrals. These people were different from the corrupted vermin below. They were all true seekers of truth, so this choice was a great pain and torture for them. Because they knew it was a lie, but they had to use nobility as an excuse to cover up the lie. This was double the damage to the shining truth. Since the decision has been made to cover up the truth with lies, then everything that happened on the battlefield of the final battle should not appear in front of the world again. After a long silence, Tolman slowly said, "But so many upper-class nobles were sacrificed on the battlefield, and there must be someone responsible for this. This person, Her Royal Highness. What about my grandfather?" Actually, no one forced Darius, but one day, he suddenly came to us, and you agreed? Brando asked in a low voice. Of course not. Tolman shook his head. But your grandfather said something to us. He said that you can't let Princess Constance bear this responsibility. She knows too much, and there are too many suspicious points in the whole incident. She can't afford to be suspected. More importantly, she is now the leader of the group of nobles who have also entered the Holy Cathedral. If you have decided to cover up everything, then you must appease each and every one of them. So, not only can she not be a sinner, she must be a hero. Your grandfather looked at us with his head held high, and his eyes flashed with a light that I still can't forget. Then he slowly said, "You have sacrificed too much for this, and I can't let all of your efforts go to waste. So, let me do it. Here, only I have the right to do it." After saying this, he turned and left the tent. Brando quietly listened to these words and did not speak for a long time. He only felt a strange emotion surging in his heart. He blinked his eyes, and his lips were a little dry and bitter. This is a noble's career, how can I let others monopolize it? There is such a man, whose silence contains too many meanings. Although he did not say a word, looking back on the past, he could answer the questions that most people in this world did not dare to face with a clear conscience. He did not let down his own beliefs, and also did not let down his beloved woman. That required not only courage, but also extraordinary wisdom. This man is his grandfather. This is a life without regrets, one can't help but yearn for it. Next up is the trial. Brando asked bitterly. He originally thought that his achievements had surpassed the figure in his memory by a lot, but now it seemed that it was just a child's play. This thought made him feel ashamed. Next up is the trial. Tolman replied in a deep voice, "That trial." Those who truly understood the truth knew that it was just a child's play. There weren't many who dared to face that lie, so there were only a few who were present. Most of the others were missing their seats. So most people think that it is a secret trial, but the truth is not like that. This is the last dignity left for your grandfather. But as a good friend of your grandfather, I was present at that time. After the trial, your grandfather should have been secretly executed, but because of the reason you know, he was only relieved of all his duties and reputation and secretly sent back to Erewhon. After that, almost no one has heard any news about him. In fact, in the whole of Wonde, there are only a few people who really know that your grandfather is still alive. These people, including the high priest of the previous generation of the Holy Cathedral, chose to self-destruct because they could not bear the torment in their hearts. Do you know? Tolman suddenly said, at the end of the trial, the Supreme Being of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the teacher of the current Holy See of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, turned around and whispered something to me. Today, how can we still pursue the truth and right? This sentence set off stormy waves in Brando's heart. At that moment, he suddenly understood why the whole continent fell into complete darkness 60 years after the War of the Holy Saints. Even the Third Holy War was called the most chaotic and the darkest war of the mortals. In the following hundreds of years, it was an era of intrigue. Opportunities and cunning conspiracies were like surging undercurrents, sweeping from beginning to end for hundreds of years. With the advent of the Slate War, the Wizards of the Light were also forced to put down their pride and join the War of the Mortals. In that war, the sky and earth changed, blood flowed like rivers on the earth, and the order of the past completely collapsed. Then, the eternal night came, and the power of dusk fell uncontrollably on the earth. The surging torrent of history, at this moment, was like a long river that flowed endlessly, surging towards him without stopping. The lock on the dusty Pandora's box finally opened in Brando's heart with a click. We are all sinners. The light of civilization has been extinguished at this moment. Next, it will be a long winter night. Perhaps in my lifetime, I will not see it light up again. Although the 4 holy cathedrals covered up all the secrets of the final battlefield, you could lie to everything, but you could not lie to yourself. In the hearts of Vala and his legendary teacher, the believers' belief in justice and truth was uncontrollably shaken. The holy cathedrals had lost their reliance on justice and glory, and everything they believed in naturally became a castle in the air. The confusion of the higher-ups inevitably spread throughout the holy cathedrals. This confusion, after brewing for nearly half a century, uncontrollably turned into a kind of panic. If people realized that everything they had insisted on before was wrong, then what was the point of their persistence? Furthermore, was the world created by the 4 sages really so correct? This is the source of everything. Tolman laughed bitterly. The bitter fruit is self-inflicted. It turns out that we made the wrong choice from the beginning. After that, according to the original plan, the dragon and the Holy Cathedral of Fire made a private exchange and Constance became the queen of the empire. This was not only to appease the nobles, but also to compensate your grandfather. However, her merits and demerits were selectively downplayed by the Holy Cathedral of Fire. After all, it was impossible for them not to have any complaints. But what we did not expect was that everything that happened in the Alcala region had an equally huge impact on the princess, who was still in her youth at that time. What we did not expect was that she eventually obtained the inheritance of the Dark Dragon. Later, we found out that before returning to the country, she had met your grandfather once. At that time, she asked your grandfather if he was willing to correct the mistakes of history with her. My grandfather, he refused. Tolman nodded. But he also kept his promise. He never revealed a word of that conversation in his life. It was not until after his death that we received a letter from him. Brando only knew that his grandfather had written a letter to these Bugas before his death. He suspected that the same letter might have been sent to the Holy Cathedral of Fire and several other major holy cathedrals. From that letter, we learned the true thoughts of the crew's queen. It turned out, she wanted to become the Dark Dragon. Become the Dark Dragon. Brando's heart skipped a beat. Not only that, we don't know what she saw in the Holy Cathedral, but she must have seen more than the nobles. She seemed to believe that what the four sages had done was a complete mistake, so she was determined to correct this mistake, whether it was for the sake of ruling the world or to uphold what she thought was right. This is... Brando asked in a low voice. The origin of this war, right? Tolman nodded slowly. Brando was silent for a moment. You knew all this a long time ago. A little earlier than you, Tolman smiled bitterly again. But we can't be sure if this is the true thoughts of the Queen. After all, she has been enduring for decades. She seems to be waiting for an opportunity, but no one knows what that opportunity is. Why didn't the Holy Cathedral of Fire stop her? Brando only realized that he had asked a stupid question after asking this question. He saw Tolman looking at him helplessly. The person involved back then was the current master of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Vala. Presumably, Vala was still in deep confusion like everyone else. If the Holy Cathedral of Fire could not confirm that everything they did was right, then what reason did they have to stop the Silver Queen? What a sin. Brando couldn't help but groan. So, you didn't choose me, did you? What right do I have to stop Her Majesty? Of course you have, little one, the old man winked at him playfully. Don't think I don't know what cards you have in your hand that you haven't played yet. Brando immediately understood what the other party was talking about. Cruz's eldest son. At this moment, he suddenly felt that he had shot himself in the foot by letting that guy stay. He couldn't help but say helplessly, well, having a trump card is one thing, but the difference in strength is another. What right do I have to sit in the same position as Her Majesty? That does seem to be the case, but what she has done is too crazy. Not everyone in the Imperium will support her. You can always find supporters, can't you? Besides, you are the descendant of Darius. No one is more suitable than you for this matter. Perhaps this is the will of the heavens, little one. And then, you Bugas will stay out of it. Brando replied with some annoyance. It's good to be clean and honest, but if you still care about your own feathers at this time, you are fishing for praise. Not to mention, you are the ones who caused this trouble. Hearing this, the old man's face darkened. He slowly shook his head. Sigh, you don't understand, little one. The four holy cathedrals are confused, but aren't we the same? Ever since that incident, we are no longer sure that we have made the right choice. There are already a lot of voices in the council asking us to stay away from the affairs of mortals as much as possible to avoid repeating the same mistakes. This time, secretly helping you build a fleet is already the best we can do. Tolman was speaking very sincerely, but Brando didn't accept his explanation. He replied, "But if even you can't be sure whether you are wrong or right, how can I be sure that standing on the opposite side of Her Majesty is definitely right? Don't tell me that in your eyes. I don't have the slightest persistence for justice in my heart. No, you are different, little one. Anyone can say that they are wrong, but you can't, because you are the descendant of Darius." Tolman looked at him and said word by word, "The noble act itself can never be wrong. Even if we doubt our own choice, we will never think that those who sacrifice themselves for justice have the persistence for their ideals in their hearts. Do you understand?" The old man patted Brando's shoulder. "The long night of civilization is coming, and the flame will be extinguished in the ashes. But under the embers, there will still be a flame. Perhaps our generation will never see it reignite again, but to you, it must be reignited and passed down from generation to generation, right? And this is the mission of the pioneers you are pursuing." After hearing this, Brando couldn't help but fall into silence. He looked to the west, and the red sun was slowly sinking below the mountains as if it was announcing the arrival of the cold night. However, in the dark night, who would hold up a torch that sparkled like stars? He looked up, and the image of the silent old man in his memory was unusually clear and distinct. At the same time, the prophecy of the future that Tolman spoke of also floated in his mind. 16. The tower, the lost moon has taken away the light XX, judgment, the light has lost. 17. The star, the silver generation has been lost on the earth, walking forward in the darkness and obscurity. 8. Strength, at the coincidental meeting of the emperor and the fool. 9. The hermit, the rusty clockwork is being reset. XXI, the world, the sword that changes fate. Chapter 978. The stars were like dust. The silver-robed mages disappeared behind the door of light one by one. Tolman looked at Brando, who had his hands on the side of the ship, leaning forward to stare at him. He smiled slightly, then turned and stepped into the door of light. He was the last Bugha to leave. The circular door of light on the bridge turned half a circle clockwise behind him, then quickly shrank into a spot of light, slowly falling to the ground like a piece of dust. Under the night sky, after the fierce battle during the day, Lone Port looked devastated. There was no one in the silent city at this time. Lone Port was not big to begin with. Except for the nobles who were reluctant to part with their properties, most of the civilians had already left or fled in the early stages of the war. The remaining refugees had been arranged on the ships by the Erewhon envoys by Brando. The nobles of Cruz were quite dissatisfied with the civilians occupying their limited survival resources and space. They had been arguing for a long time, but Brando could not be bothered with these people. This was a fleet that belonged to Valhalla and also belonged to him. He did not need to care. The silver fleet floated above the dock like a school of fish. Frigates of various sizes surrounded a few larger capital ships. In the middle of the fleet was the flagship Akhenaten. Under the clear starlight, the sailors tightened the ropes under the chief mate's command, and the silver sails were bulging. Brando listened to the command, and his heart was calm. He saw that on the deck, Sergeant Marjorie from Yanalasu was commanding the sailors to roll the wooden buckets filled with fresh water and food off the deck. The lads who were going out to sea for the first time were not skilled, but they were diligent. Not only was the gangplank on the side of the ship not retracted, but an extra one was added. A certain lady, who had always considered herself as the commercial ambassador of Erewhon, stood on the edge of the gangplank. She wore a thick fur coat, a mink shawl, and a cute round hat. She seemed to be unable to withstand the biting cold wind at high altitude. She kept rubbing her hands, and her exposed face was red from the cold. But even so, she still earnestly exhorted the sailors beside her, "You guys are so clumsy, it's really worrying. Be careful later. That's an elegant lady of noble birth. Don't scare her." No problem, Roman lady. That's right. Young mistress, you should go to the bottom of the cabin first. If anything happens to you in the cold, Sir Monarch will get angry again. Unfortunately, the sailors were very familiar with this young lady's temperament and were not afraid at all. Instead, they laughed and replied, Don't talk nonsense. Your lord has a good temper. He won't get angry. Roman hurriedly retorted. Although she said so, she still looked at Brando with a guilty conscience. Seeing that the latter was absent-minded, she could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. She patted her chest and couldn't help but fly into a rage out of humiliation. If you keep talking nonsense, I'll arrange for you to wash the deck. Only then did the sailors shut up, laughing and laughing. Brando waited until the young lady turned her head before he withdrew his gaze. He could not help but shake his head and laugh, but in his heart, he had a faint understanding. The Bugis and the 4 holy cathedrals had realized their mistake. Because it was impossible to achieve the goal of justice through deceit. If there was a deviation in the direction from the beginning, the goal achieved could only bear bitter fruit. But was Her Majesty the Queen, who stood on the opposite side of the 4 holy cathedrals, right? Brando thought that might not be the case. Because the Bugis, the Dragon Clan, and the 4 holy cathedrals were at least right about one thing: madness can only lead to the destruction of order. It can't bring new life from the ruins. No one has the right to decide the fate of others, and no one has the right to drag the world into the flames of war. Blood can't bring about revolution, only endless hatred. Maybe I don't know how to stand on the side of justice. But at least I know what are beautiful and precious things in this world. I also know how to use the sword of a knight. Brando muttered to himself, so the Queen is indeed drifting away on the path of bigotry. A black carriage appeared on the bridge like a ghost. It quietly drove to the Akhenaten and then stopped beside the gangplank. Although the sailors were laughing and joking, they perked up at this moment because the carriage was escorted by 3 Valkyries. These female knights, who rode flaming warhorses, held spears, and wore armor, had already shown amazing strength in the battle in the afternoon. And there was someone in the envoy group who needed their protection. Everyone was startled. Not only these sailors, but the nobles who saw this scene on the warships near and far were also subconsciously puzzled. Most of them immediately turned their eyes to the flagship. The mysterious count had already boarded the ship, so who could be in the carriage? Could it be that the Princess of Erewhon had come in person? Even the people in the envoy group looked at each other. Eugenie couldn't help but nudge Marjorie with her elbow. Have you seen Princess Magadol? She asked. The young officer shook his head. She's on the ship, with Judy. What about the eldest daughter of the Yenbao family? Miss Dilfery. I just saw her. Who could it be? Is it really the princess? Duke Viro's daughter frowned and said rudely as she bit the tip of her nail. She was the kind of woman who had a particularly strong desire for control. Every time something unexpected happened, she would feel very uneasy. You're thinking too much, Miss Eugenie. Marjorie was very calm. He looked at the former and said indifferently. The carriage stopped at the side of the gangplank, then the door opened, and Yuta jumped out. The people who saw this scene were slightly stunned at first, but then they recognized that this was the female adjutant of Count Erewhon. Unexpectedly, there was someone who needed her to personally look after. Everyone couldn't help but be curious. They stared fixedly at the carriage, as if it had come out after a long time. Finally, a person slowly walked down from the carriage. But it was a man. Ah! Eugenie saw the man. She was so scared that she almost screamed. On the other ships, the group of crew's nobles also looked like ducks that had been grabbed by the throat. They looked at the man as if he was the devil. Some of the weaker ones took a few steps back, and some of the unlucky ones stepped on the ropes and fell on their butts. Even so, they still hadn't woken up. Their faces were as white as a sheet of paper, completely drained of blood. Count Alcorn was frowning and took out his pocket watch from his clothes to look at the time under the moonlight, but at this moment, as if he was possessed, he stood there motionlessly. He didn't even notice that the pocket watch in his hand fell to the deck with a bang, and the glass cover broke into pieces. "What's wrong?" Marjorie seemed to have realized that the atmosphere around him was a little different. He asked the Duke's daughter next to him. "It's him." Oni's teeth were chattering. Even though she was trying her best to suppress her shameful emotions, she could not stop herself from gurgling. "It's that person. The leader is actually with him. No wonder he's so fearless. If in the history of the Empire, there was a person who could make all the nobles in the Empire pale at the mention of his name, and the appearance of this person was known to everyone in the Empire, but even so, the powerful Cruz Empire still couldn't do anything to him for hundreds of years. Then this person only had a name and a title. His name was Mephisto, and his title was the Ash Sword Saint. Mephisto slowly stepped down from the carriage. He was an extremely elegant middle-aged man. He had lived a luxurious life for the first half of his life, and the aura of a fallen aristocrat was branded on him like a label. He was like a prince who had wandered to another country, and wherever he went, he would involuntarily become the center of attention. He was wearing a dark trench coat, and the famous ash sword was on his back. His face was a little determined, but the most eye-catching thing was his pair of cold eyes. Mephisto raised his head and glanced at everyone in the fleet, making everyone in the Cruz Empire feel a chill in their hearts. Time seemed to have frozen. Yuta and Mephisto got on the ship one after the other. They walked across the gangplank as if they were walking on flat ground and came to Brando's side. Brando looked at the two people and couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. He smiled and said, "Sorry to trouble you, teacher. I didn't expect to get you involved." The Ash Sword Saint looked at his student. This time, he had actually been following behind the diplomatic group, moving together with the Valkyrie and the Buga puppets. Originally, according to the original arrangement, it was not appropriate for him to show up on this diplomatic mission, unless it was the most critical moment. But he didn't expect that the plan would change so quickly. After Brando asked Yuta to tell him the plan, he only thought for a moment, and then the scene described above happened. Mephisto knew that his student wanted to use his name to show off, but he didn't care about it. First of all, he was very satisfied with Brando, his only student. Second, he never thought of hiding in front of the Cruz Empire. Before he stepped into the Supreme Realm, the Empire couldn't do anything to him, let alone now. So he just responded faintly, "Just do it. You are my student, I will naturally stand behind you." Brando was slightly startled and couldn't help but feel a little touched. He looked at the weather-beaten middle-aged man, who was also his cheap teacher. In his mind, although the relationship between the two of them was teacher and student, it was inevitable that there would be the color of a transaction. After all, from the beginning, this relationship was maintained by equivalent exchange. He didn't expect that after going through so much, the other party seemed to really treat him as a student. He nodded slightly and replied in a deep voice, "I understand, teacher." Mephisto still had a serious look on his face. He just nodded and said, "I'll go down first." Seeing these hypocritical Cruz people is really unpleasant. Brando couldn't help but smile bitterly. Now the world thought that he, the Count of Valhalla, was bold enough to slap the face of the Cruz Empire, but he didn't expect that Mephisto, the old enemy of the Empire, was even more arrogant. Even he didn't dare to slap the face of the Cruz people for no reason. One must know that Count Alcorn was not far away now. Although Mephisto was talking to him alone, his voice was not low at all. He must have deliberately said it for the other party to hear. But this was nothing. What was outrageous was that those arrogant Cruz nobles who always complained about this and that, at this moment, seemed to have become speechless. They all lowered their heads and pretended not to see this scene. Although Count Alcorn's face was green and white, he didn't dare to say a word. What was deterrence? This was deterrence. Brando watched Mephisto walk down the deck, but he couldn't help but curse in his heart. He didn't see his teacher say this when he saw the beautiful Legion commander of the azure firmament. It was really hypocritical. But thinking of this, he also remembered that he hadn't heard any news about Veronica for a while. Although the lady was from Cruz, she was one of the few people he respected. For a moment, he couldn't help but worry a little. At this time, the black carriage was arranged by the Roman to board the Akhenaten. The sailors couldn't help but be puzzled. "Miss Roman, didn't you say that there was a noble and elegant lady in the carriage? That doesn't look like a lady at all. Why isn't there a lady?" The merchant girl quibbled. "Didn't you see? Miss, you're not talking about Lady Yuta, are you? Isn't she the leader of the mercenaries? How can she be considered a noble and elegant lady?" The sailors suddenly became noisy. "Merchants have to be trustworthy." "Of course we have to be trustworthy, but loopholes in words can also be exploited, right?" The Roman smiled. "TSK," for a moment, the sailors booed. But the merchant girl didn't care at all. She asked the sailors to put away the gangplank, then went to Brando's side and proudly made an "okay" gesture. Brando was unmoved. He pinched the tip of her little nose, then said to Yuta, who was beside him, "Is everything loaded on the ship?" Yuta nodded. "The puppets and gargoyles have been loaded. But my lord, there aren't many gargoyles left. If the dragons attack again, they will definitely come again. The one behind us should be Modesty. I know her character very well." Brando glanced at the great plains under the night sky. The scattered stardust dotted the dark curtain, but the most dazzling of all was the constellation of Dragon King Bahamut in the eastern sky. Just beside this majestic star chart was a patch of darkness. It was said that before the War of the Holy Saints, this constellation belonged to the Dark Dragon. It had already fallen for thousands of years. The Roman raised her eyebrows and raised her head, trying to escape from Brando's evil clutches. But she was just a pitiful little witch. How could she be a match for a warrior like Brando? Not long after, she looked at this hateful guy with tears in her eyes. "Brando, if you don't let go, I'll bite you." As if to make this threat more convincing, the merchant girl showed her white and sharp canine teeth. Brando smiled and let go of his hand. The latter hurriedly took a step back, rubbing his red nose and staring warily at Brendel. "Can they catch up with us?" Yuta looked at the young couple with interest and asked. "Yes, the dragons are much faster than the oldest frigates. Plus, we're carrying the refugees." Brando replied. "Then if we set sail now, won't they catch up with us at sea?" Yuta frowned. "It doesn't matter." Brando thought that Modesty might join the battle herself after learning that the Bugas had intervened. But he still replied calmly, "They can't stop us. Yuta, go and inform the Shire and Marjorie to come to the drafting room." "Oh yes, and the fat man." Yuta nodded and was about to leave when Brando called her again. "Wait. What's wrong?" The mercenary leader turned around in confusion. "Yuta," Brando hesitated before asking, "I remember you seem to know my grandfather." Yuta was slightly startled and then reacted. Her eyes lit up and she replied with some reverence, "Yes, my lord. In Erewhon, how could anyone not know your grandfather? Lord Darius, in that era, he was one of the two pillars of the kingdom, but..." She looked at her lord with some appreciation, thinking that this was probably the so-called family inheritance of the nobles. Both the grandfather and the grandson were so outstanding. But why did some nobles decay from generation to generation? It was not the first time she was puzzled about this question, but she could not think of an answer. But what? Yuta seemed to have taken a while to make up her mind to continue this question. She replied, "But my lord, when your grandfather became famous, I wasn't born yet. In fact, I saw him after he went into seclusion." "My lord." She looked at the young man in front of her and replied, "You know, near Bragg's. In fact, I saw you at that time." "What?" Brando was stunned. He never dreamed that he would have such a relationship with this mercenary leader. "My lord, do you remember that I told you about my past?" Recalling the things that happened before, Yuta's voice could not help but lower. "My sister and I were still adventurers at that time. Later, we were persecuted by the nobles and had no choice but to go into exile. Later, my lord, your grandfather saved my life. Unfortunately, my sister was not so lucky and did not survive until then. It was at that time that I saw you and your grandfather." She could not help but smile gently and made a gesture. "At that time, my lord, you were only this tall." Brando was stunned for a moment before he reacted. There seemed to be such a thing in his memory, but before Yuta mentioned it, it was just a small episode in his childhood memory. It had long been blurred. He took a deep look at the mercenary leader and asked, "You recognized me from the beginning?" Jana shook her head. "That was something that happened a long time later. Only then did I realize that the old man was the famous sword Saint Darius. Later on, I deliberately collected some information about him, but I didn't dare to publicize it. Later on, when I met Milord, I didn't recognize Milord at first. After all, Milord was still so young at that time." She couldn't help but laugh. Who would have thought that such a cute little fellow at that time would grow up to be such an indomitable man? Compared to Milord, I was really a failure. Later. After that incident in Shaflun town, I confirmed your identity from Lord Coden. From then on, I decided to follow you wholeheartedly." The mercenary leader recalled with some emotion. She subconsciously looked at her sword. "My lord," she raised her head, "is there anything else?" Brando shook his head and felt that it was a pity. He originally wanted to know more about his grandfather from Yuta, but he did not expect that she did not know more than he did. "Nothing," he replied. "You can go now, Yuta." "Thank you." "It's my pleasure, my lord," the mercenary leader replied with a smile. Suddenly, she thought of something and asked, "By the way, my lord, is your aunt doing well?" "My aunt?" Brando was stunned for a moment. His mother had a few aunts in Karsuk, but there was very little contact between them in Cardareg and his family. He had never seen those relatives in Cardareg, so he did not understand why Yuta suddenly asked this question. "Yes, it's the lady who was with your grandfather at that time. Speaking of which, she was the one who saved me first," Yuta replied. "I haven't seen that kind lady for a long time, and I haven't found a chance to thank her." "What?" Brendel was stunned for a moment, because there was no such person in his memory. He could not help but rub his forehead, wondering if his memory was too blurry and he missed out on many details. He only remembered that he was practicing swordsmanship at the sawmill by the river, and it was his grandfather who saved a woman. As for whether it was Yuta or not, in fact, he could not remember clearly. As for whether there was another woman at that time, it was even more impossible to talk about. However, in his memory, he only remembered that there were not many outsiders who had contact with his family. Other than some of his father's business friends, his grandfather basically did not have any contact. Every day, he just supervised his swordsmanship. Could it be that he remembered wrongly? Brando could not help but rub his forehead, feeling a headache coming on. "My lord." Yuta looked at him worriedly. "It's nothing," Brando shook his head. "My aunt, she..." "Well, it's okay, I'll bring you to see her next time." The mercenary leader nodded in satisfaction, and did not hear any hint of perfunctory intention. Chapter 979. There were no lights on the entire fleet. It was like a school of black fish floating in the night sky. The moonlight occasionally passed through the clouds, sprinkling the clear light on the undulating sea, and also reflected the shadow of the fleet on the waves. The silver sails were sometimes bright and sometimes dark, like a sparkling silver light. The entire fleet rumbled in the air, but the more it was so, the more silent the night seemed to be. The entire vast sky of the sublime inland sea seemed to be shrouded in this strange atmosphere. The atmosphere in the drafting room was also a little quiet. Several large maps of the entire empire and the surrounding areas of the sublime inland sea were spread out on the table. A black-sheathed dagger was pressed against the corner of one side, and a sextant or something similar was placed on the other side. There were a few chairs placed around the table. Marjorie, the Shire, Avram, Count Alcorn, and another representative elected by the nobles sat around the table. Brando sat at the head of the table. Behind him stood the female mercenary commander Yuta with a sword and Hippamra with a scepter. The ladies did not want to squeeze with these men, so they stood a little further away and watched the men discuss from afar. In fact, except for Chiara and Eugenie, the other ladies were not interested in this boring meeting. Enid accompanied the little princess of House Cypher, and Judy was used to following Eugenie. After all, the little girl was not even 11 years old, and she was still afraid of being alone. In the middle of the crowd stood a young man. He was wearing a captain's uniform, a blue-gray coat, a badge with golden tassels hanging from the shoulder, a ribbon, light gray breeches, black boots, and a pair of white gloves. He gestured on the map and said, "My lord, our first task now is to determine the route. Such a large fleet can't always drift at sea, and supplies are a big problem. Therefore, we have to find a suitable target port. This place must meet the following conditions. First, it must be able to accommodate our fleet. Second, it must be able to provide us with sufficient supplies for a long time. Third, and most importantly, the port must have an attitude towards us. This is also the guarantee of the first two conditions. To be able to accommodate a fleet like ours, it must be at least a Grade 1 port. There aren't many such ports around the sublime inland sea." Avram replied, panting. The cabin was so hot and stuffy that the heir to the Duke's throne was covered in sweat. His silk robe was also soaked in sweat. His maid kept fanning him, but to no avail. His sweat was flowing like a waterfall. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief and continued, "Only Cloak Bay, Metz, and other commercial areas have such ports. I thought for a while, and the closest ones to us should be Emma, Golden Harbor, and Faden." He was not as bossy and domineering as the other nobles. On the contrary, he was a little timid. Perhaps it was because he had too much contact with the family business that he had picked up the cautious habits of a merchant. After wiping the sweat off his forehead, he frowned and said worriedly, "Captain, an anchorage with a Grade 1 port is most likely able to support a fleet like ours for a long time. But the problem is that the people of Cruz may not be at ease with a fleet like ours entering their port." "My lord, you originally," Brando of course knew what this cautious guy was going to say. Originally, they thought that Brando only had a few ships in his hands. With the Avram family's connections in the empire, as long as they asked their business partners to take care of it, they would be able to easily settle the problem of docking and replenishing at the port. But to let the people of Cruz turn a blind eye and let such a large fleet enter the port, or even just pass through the waters near the port, was not a small matter. His original connections might not be of use. This was also the trouble that the Bugis gave him. Brando would never have thought that such a large fleet would arrive at the empire. But of course, he would not let Avram finish his sentence. He interrupted him with a look and said, "I know, you don't have to worry. You just need to inform your friends in advance and let them rest assured, lest the people of Cruz think that we are their enemies." "Is that so?" Avram muttered in his heart. Was it really that simple? Such a large fleet that did not belong to them suddenly appeared in the Empire's territory. The people of Cruz who were in charge would not even be able to sleep well. It was a little too much to say that they could rest assured. It was just that these days, Brando had already established an unquestionable authority in the diplomatic group, so these doubts could only rot in his stomach. He would never speak out rashly. Brando's eyes swept across the yellowed maps, his eyes moving along the rugged coastline of the sublime inland sea as if he was thinking. After a long while, he made a decision. Let's go to Fathom. For a moment, the room was so quiet that even a pin drop could be heard. Everyone followed the young count's gaze to find their final destination. The two nobles of Cruz were obviously more familiar with their homeland. Fathom was located in the province of Amelin, located at the estuary of the Marigold River. The province of Amelin was east of the short Main Mountains, which happened to be the westernmost point of the Metz region. It was the northern gateway of the Evergreen Corridor. This was the heartland of the Northwest Territory of the Empire, and Fathom Port was the center of this region. It was also one of the largest ports in western Metz. Count Alcon glanced at the map, frowned, and said, "Isn't this place too close?" Brando glanced at him and understood what he meant. Was Fathom Port too close to the Evergreen Corridor? He was afraid that the army of Georgiandy Ridge would come all the way north after breaking through Fort Asaph. After experiencing a life of panic and desperation, he finally had a chance to catch his breath. He did not want such an experience to happen again. He shook his head gently. In fact, the reason why they chose Fathom Port was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. Tumen had chosen this port for them a long time ago. Although the Bugis did not say why, Brando believed that the other party must have some information, but for some reason, he could not say it so directly. He could even boldly guess that the Silver Folk might have used their monitoring stations on the ground. Therefore, at such a sensitive time, Tumen could only choose such a subtle way to remind him. This short meeting at the moment, to put it bluntly, was just a cover for the eyes and ears of the nobles of Cruz. Brando replied, "Earl Alcon, the White Legion is still in the Evergreen Corridor. The army of Georgiandy Ridge won't be able to break through this line of defense so easily. Taking a step back, if the White Legion can't stop them, then there's no safe place in the entire Metz area. You can't expect us to go directly to the heart of the Empire, right?" Earl Alcon frowned. He could hear the meaning behind the young Earl's words. Besides, he also understood what it meant for such a large fleet to go directly to the heart of the Empire. At that time, no matter whether they had good or bad intentions, they would only be greeted by a frontal attack from the Cruz Royal Fleet and the Pegasus Knight Regiment that guarded the imperial capital. Then, said another noble of Cruz who was present. He was the representative of the other nobles outside of Lone Port. He was a nice gentleman with a kind face, but now he looked more nervous than Earl Alcon. "Why don't we go to Cloak Bay?" The real reason for not going to Cloak Bay was naturally that Tolman had warned him in advance. Most of the nobles who knew about the final battle were now rooted in this area. Needless to say, these people must be Her Majesty the Queen's hardcore supporters. And in the past few decades, the Silver Queen had never put the nobles in this area in an important position. She only let them firmly control the Empire's navy. This news made Brando more vigilant than Her Majesty the Queen's attention to these nobles. Obviously, Constance regarded these people as an important support behind her. She wouldn't put them on the table unless it was a critical moment, which was commonly known as a trump card. Knowing this, Brando naturally wouldn't foolishly walk into the other party's trap. Between Cloak Bay and Metz, it was obvious that the former couldn't be approached no matter what. But he couldn't say that now. Brando glanced at the man. The other party's question was actually within his expectations. Fortunately, these Cruz people hadn't begun to suspect anything yet. They just instinctively wanted to stay away from danger. He smiled slightly and replied with a confident look, "In fact, you two don't have to worry so much. With my fleet alone, the Georgiandy Ridge people can't do anything to us. Instead, the Empire's army is a bigger threat to us. You two don't want to die in the hands of your own people for no reason after escaping from danger, right? This is the heart of the Empire. Everything must be done with caution. The reason why I chose Fat Han was also because I considered many factors. First of all, I don't want to have a conflict with the Empire's navy, and I don't want to make Your Majesty the Queen feel too nervous. To be honest, I'm just the leader of a small envoy group. If it weren't for the current situation, I wouldn't want to make things so troublesome. So, let's not complicate the situation further. What do you think? Count Alcorn thought for a moment and felt that it seemed to be the case. However, he really sneered at Brando's words of, "I'm just the leader of a small envoy group." Since ancient times, has there been such an envoy group? The only thing left was to drive the fleet straight into the imperial capital and force Her Majesty the Queen to abdicate. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel a little strange. He wondered if the Empire had offended this damn guy in some way. Otherwise, how could he be so arrogant? He thought for a while before he slowly nodded and agreed with Brando's statement. And the remaining Mr. Nice Guy actually followed Alcorn's lead, so naturally, he couldn't put forward any other opinions. After the two sides discussed for a while, they basically confirmed some of the details. In fact, these Cruz nobles had nothing to do with it. Brando's request for them was basically to not cause any trouble. However, this feeling made Count Alcorn very uncomfortable, so he took the initiative to propose that after they arrived at Fat Han, he could also use some of his connections to at least let the Cruz people guarantee the supply of their fleet. Of course, he also considered this from the perspective of his own safety. After all, Brando's fleet was his only protection at the moment. After confirming the route, the Cruz nobles who had been nervous all day finally relaxed. Only at this time, the fatigue suddenly returned to these nobles who lived like princes. After a whole day of fear, after witnessing a great battle and back and forth, even a figure like Count Alcorn couldn't help but feel a little dizzy and quickly took his leave to rest. After these Cruz nobles left one by one, Brando immediately removed his relaxed appearance and became serious. He ordered all the members of the diplomatic group to stay, and this time, the location of the meeting was chosen in the captain's room. The captain's room of the Akhenaten was quite spacious and luxurious. It didn't seem cramped when it accommodated all the members of the diplomatic group. However, at this moment, the atmosphere in the room was a little solemn, and a strange silence lingered around everyone. Avram was still wiping his sweat, but his maid was nowhere to be seen. Eugenie frowned and bit her lower lip. She subconsciously glanced at Marjorie next to her. Among all of them, only the young officer seemed to be relatively calm. The latter stood there straight, motionless, like a soldier waiting for the general's orders. Not far away, the captain of the Akhenaten looked over curiously, wondering who this was. Could it be the Lord's confidant? But why hadn't he seen him before? Beside Marjorie, there were several other ladies in the diplomatic group. Enide and Judy were very nervous. Count Yenbao's daughter was slightly better, but she was still immersed in the previous shock and had not recovered. Only Princess Magadal was calm. Beside her, Chiara's expression was very complicated. Sometimes she raised her eyebrows, and sometimes she revealed a strange smile. But overall, she looked exuberant, and at first glance, it was obvious that she wanted to see the world in chaos. After a long period of silence, someone finally broke the dead atmosphere. The one who spoke was Eugenie. "Captain, we believe that you will not speak without thinking, but what you said is too. She originally wanted to say that it was too far-fetched. If it was 1 or 2 months ago, she would definitely have said it. But unknowingly, Brando had already established an image of authority in the hearts of these people. Even if she did not want to admit it, she had already subconsciously acknowledged this point. This rude word circled in her mouth a few times, but in the end, she did not say it out loud. Brando looked at these people. He chose to tell them the truth that Tumen revealed to him, not because of a moment of impulse, but because at this time, he at least needed the support and recognition from his own country. What he needed to do now was to control the crew's nobles and prevent them from causing trouble. To do this, he alone was not enough. He needed the help of others. And these Erewhon nobles in the envoy group were the support he could rely on. In fact, it was not until this moment that Brando felt a sense of identity with the nobles of this kingdom for the first time. These young descendants of the nobles had not been completely influenced by the set of rules of their parents. The innate rebellion in their bodies bloomed with the brilliance of freedom and ideals. This vitality was incompatible with this decadent and ancient kingdom. I believe that you can judge for yourselves whether what I said is true or false. Brando only gave a simple answer. Eugenie did not speak anymore. If Brando had told them these things for the first time, they might have doubted it. But in fact, as early as when they broke through the defense line of the army of Georgiandy Ridge, the captain had presciently warned them that the dragons might be related to the Silver Queen. With this layer of doubt, and after connecting all the clues together, all the problems were solved. In fact, they had already accepted this statement in their hearts, but because it was too shocking, they could not reverse their original understanding of this world. But after a moment, the officer who stood like a javelin opened his mouth. "Sir Lord," he said in a deep voice. Brando was slightly startled. He suddenly realized that Marjorie called him Sir Lord, and not the captain like the others. He could not help but look at the other with some doubts. "Sir Lord," Marjorie replied, "if you have any orders, please give them. I am a soldier, and I know what to do at this time." Brando looked at this guy in surprise. He thought that he would have to persuade Eugenie first, but he did not expect this guy who was usually silent to speak first. He nodded slightly and looked at the others. "What about everyone?" "Sir, are we going to war with the Empire?" Enaid asked with some fear. "No," Brando shook his head, "but I'm afraid that we are going to war with Her Majesty the Queen. But you don't have to worry too much, we may not be fighting alone." "Sir, are you saying that someone will help us?" Avram asked with a stutter. "You will know when the time comes." Brando stared at the huge map of the entire empire hanging on the wall of the captain's room, and his eyes fell on the location of Fathom Harbor as he answered faintly. Then, he changed his tone and gave an order. "Marjorie, Avram, this is your real order, listen carefully." Both of them subconsciously became serious. "When the fleet arrives at Fathom Harbor, your mission is to immediately take over the harbor." Brando emphasized the word, take over, whether by peaceful means or by force. He raised his head, and his eyes were so bright that it was as if there were a ball of fire. "Do you understand?" The two young men were stunned at the same time. Chapter 980. After the storm, there was a touch of intoxicating blue under the dark sea. The sun passed through the dark clouds, and the sky behind them gradually became clear again. After the storm, there was only a thin drizzle left in the sky, shining with golden light under the sun. The drizzle fell on the mast of the fleet, washing away the scorch marks and bloodstains on the silver sails. The whole fleet floated above the sublime inland sea, full of scars, like a giant beast that had fallen into silence, telling the story of the battle that had just happened. The group of dragons was retreating like the tide. Modesty flapped her wings that covered the sun, and the clouds that were sucked into the vortex under her wings were torn apart like a torrent hitting a reef, turning into scattered flame fragments. She confronted the human fleet in mid-air, staring at them with hatred. Her golden pupils showed a look of resentment and unwillingness, but the shocking sword that split the storm in half a moment ago made her terrified. Supreme Sword Saint, there was actually a Supreme Sword Saint in this small human fleet. That black-clothed human man's cold eyes made her unable to summon up any will to resist. Damn it, if only that arrogant guy Obsidian was here, he would definitely teach them a lesson. The female black dragon gritted her teeth, but she had to admit defeat. She used her claws to signal her dragon general not to act rashly. Go, retreat. They are going to Faust. Let's wait and see. We will meet again there. Modesty squeezed these words out of her teeth. As soon as she turned around, it was as if a dark cloud had moved away from the sky, and the shadow that shrouded the fleet was gone. The dragons had left. They are retreating, the crowd screamed. They could hardly believe that they had withstood the storm and defeated the attack of the dragons. It was almost a miracle, no, a miracle. Everyone understood that the biggest crisis had passed. Now, the vast sea would be a smooth journey for them, and there would be no more obstacles. After the storm, the rainbow hanging in the sky was so clear. The people of Cruz who had participated in the previous battle could not help but shout and cry. The nobles, however, did not care about their dignity anymore. They walked to the deck one after another. Seeing this scene, their legs felt weak. They leaned on the mast and drew Martha's holy emblem, whispering praises for the blessing of the god. However, they hadn't forgotten who had created this miracle. Although they were extremely unwilling to admit that it was an heroine who had achieved all of this, from Vargas to Lone Harbor, and from Lone Harbor to the sublime inland sea, it was as if nothing could hinder the young man's confidence. They are, after all, that person's descendants. He's a descendant of the Highland Knight. The crowd whispered such words in low voices. More and more people gathered at the side of the ship and cheered loudly, celebrating this hard-won victory and hysterically venting their feelings. However, those who had truly participated in the preparation of this war could not think of anything else at this time. They only felt deeply exhausted, both physically and mentally. It was as if after suddenly relaxing, the fatigue and mental dispiritedness swept over them. Brando stood on the stern of the Akhenaten. At a glance, he saw the merchant lady in the crowd who had fallen asleep in Yuta's arms. Even in her sleep, the Roman still frowned slightly, as if she was still continuing her previous work. Seeing this scene, Brando could not help but feel his heart soften. In the past 40 hours, the entire fleet's countless supplies were uniformly allocated by the merchant lady alone. Nearly 2 days and 2 nights of continuous work, she did not have the slightest time to rest. But all of this was almost perfectly completed with the support of the merchant lady's extraordinary talent. Her terrifying memory and keen sense of the flow of supplies even amazed Brando. In the past, he rarely intervened in the business affairs of the Roman territory, nor did he see how this lady could command the wind and rain in her own territory. But at this moment, he understood why the business activities of the AB's territory could be so orderly from the beginning, even far surpassing its other industries. Brando, those monsters have attacked us more than the other side. There are 16 small boats and 4 large ships on the other side. Their consumption of magic crystals and ammunition should be much lower than expected. If the 27 ships on this side run out of ammunition, you can find a way to balance it from the other side. Also, the little Roman carefully reminded him with a pair of dark circles under her eyes, the ship that was hit was the Deer and 3 other ships. 2 of them fell into the sea. The ships that fell into the sea should be carrying food and drinking water, which is a third of our supplies. I've already placed the remaining transport ships in the middle of the fleet. Brando, you have to be careful and protect them. After saying those words, she yawned, tilted her head and fell into a deep sleep in his arms. She even snored softly, as if she was not worried that Brendel would take advantage of her, which made Brendel smile bitterly. It was a pity that Brando wanted to give the merchant lady who had been following him wholeheartedly since Butchie a warm hug, but the fleet could not leave his command for even a moment. He could only cruelly leave the latter in Yuta's care. Thinking of the battle that had just ended, he felt a little lucky. It was a rare storm on the sublime sea. Lightning fell like a curtain from the dark clouds. However, the storm was not only a hindrance to the humans, but also to the attack of the draconic beasts. That was the reason why he pushed the fleet to deviate from their course and plunged into the dangerous storm. He knew that these dragons from the underground would not be able to adapt to the complex and changeable climate on the sea. Reality proved that his common sense in the game saved everyone once again. Modesty organized many attacks in the storm, but none of them worked. The dragons were not used to the stormy clouds, let alone launching an effective attack. Instead, some of them fell into the sea due to the loss of altitude. On the other hand, although the human fleet was slow, the sailors who were used to standing with the wind and waves could always effectively prevent the fleet from getting lost. Although Modesty was angry about this, it was useless. Although the dragons were powerful, they were not omnipotent. The most threatening attack was on the eve of the storm, but unfortunately, it did not deviate from Brando's prediction. He knew the character of the Black Dragon well, so he had already arranged a strategy to meet the attack. Moreover, this time, even God was on the side of the humans. The storm lasted for 2 days and 2 nights, and the dragons were already exhausted. When they were forced by Modesty to launch their final attack, the Sword of the Ash Sword Saint dispelled all of her delusions. Although the humans had the upper hand, but for the past 2 days, everyone recalled that it was a tragic battle. The fleet lost more than 10% of the warships, and the casualties were uncountable. Many people died in battle, but more losses came from the storm itself. It was a nightmare, but fortunately, it was finally over. The sailors and officers, after shouting and cheering with all their might, one by one, fell down on the deck, snoring. At this time, there was no chief officer to urge them to stand up and continue fighting. Soon, there was only one voice on the deck. "How lucky, my lord." The Shire was a mess. His beautiful magus robe was wrinkled and stuck to his body because it was soaked in water. He walked up to the poop, wiping the beads of water on his forehead with his hand, and complained to Brando, "We encountered a storm on the shining sea before. The storm on the open sea was much worse than here. Your grandfather vomited a lot at that time." Brando stared at the guy who ruined his grandfather's image. The Shire felt a little guilty under the stare. He spread out his hands and said, "Well, I admit that I vomited a little, but I'm a wizard. You know, our willpower is always stronger than the average person. Your face is so pale that it's not very convincing." "That's because I'm too sleepy, my lord." "How come I didn't know that heroic spirits need to sleep?" "I think that lady has a different opinion," the Shire smiled. Brando knew that this guy was talking about Saint Ossol, the Wind Empress. He secretly cursed him for being cunning. He didn't dare to expose that elf's shortcomings. Tap. Brando heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw a pair of black high-heeled shoes. The rose inlaid on the tip of the shoes was as eye-catching as blood. It was as dazzling as snow. On the ankle was an ebony skirt. She had a slender waist, layers of lace corsets, and thin shoulder straps that tightly wrapped around her snow-white shoulders. She had a slender neck, a sharp chin, long hair that was dyed black, red eyes that were as bright as agate, slender eyebrows that were raised high, and a forehead that was as smooth as jade. "Why did you come out?" Brando frowned and asked unhappily. This was troublesome. It wasn't easy for him to get her on the ship without anyone noticing. He didn't want her to be exposed in public. If the successor of the Dark Dragon was a rat on the street, then if this lady's identity was exposed, he would immediately become the public enemy of the civilization. "It's too stuffy in the carriage." Dark Kohua wrinkled her nose and made a sound that was almost undetectable. Brando glanced at the Shire, and the latter nodded knowingly. He placed his hand on his chest and bowed to Kohua. "I'll go arrange rooms for Miss Eugenie and the others. There are too many people on the deck." Dark Kohua's eyes were filled with disdain. She was about to express her disdain for such hypocrisy when she heard Brando sternly say to her, "Come with me." The second deck of the Enchanting's stern was surrounded by a hollow corridor. After the storm, a lot of rain had poured in, and the corridor was still wet. Brando silently led Dark Cohua through the corridor. Halfway through, he stopped and turned to look at her. "You're looking for trouble. You're obviously young, but you're as cautious as an old man." Dark Cohua pursed her lips. "I smelled the scent of those disgusting reptiles. I just wanted to see if you needed help. Those people outside don't recognize me at all. What are you afraid of? Don't underestimate humans. Don't forget who defeated you. Besides, I have a dragon on my ship. Do you think she won't recognize you?" Brando replied in annoyance. "No wonder it's so smelly here. But even dragons are divided into several generations. Little reptiles born after the age of chaos might not be able to recognize me." The girl snorted. "Besides, do you think I want to see a despicable person like you? If it wasn't for someone telling me to come out, I wouldn't be bothered to wander around this stinking place." "Someone told you to come out?" Brando had expected this girl to be insincere. Although she said there was no need to worry, she was usually more cautious than anyone else. She wouldn't easily appear in front of anyone. This woman seemed arrogant on the surface, but she was a person who cherished her life and craved power. Unless she had no other choice, she wouldn't easily expose herself to danger. "I was the one who told her to come out." A gentle voice suddenly sounded in their minds. Brando was slightly startled. He immediately recognized the voice. The Wind Empress. He didn't expect that the Elf Queen, who hadn't appeared for a long time, would choose to appear at this time. He couldn't help but feel excited. In fact, he had a lot of questions to ask her, but the great sage didn't give him the opportunity to do so. "Brando." But Saint Ossoul's voice was unusually serious today. Accompanied by her words, a shadow gradually formed in the corridor. Brando had seen the appearance of the sage in the Schaflund silver mine before, but she was not like this at that time. At this moment, the elf wore a silver crown and armor. The armor showed a faint purple brilliance. Her whole body was like a dragon bearing its fangs and brandishing its claws. A thick fur cloak trailed behind her. The edge of the cloak was embroidered with the royal emblem of the Mist Elves. On the inside, there was an emblem of intertwined stars and moons. An amethyst-like sword hung on the waist of the elf lady. On the hilt of the sword was the legendary treasure of the Mist Elves, the starry diamond. When Brando saw Saint Ossoul like this, he couldn't help but be stunned. But he immediately reacted. This was the legendary armor of the Wind Empress in the War of the Holy Saints. It was also the symbol of the elven royal family, Stardust's lament. Legend said that this armor had long disappeared in the long river of history with the Mist Elves. But when it reappeared one day on the body of the Queen of the Elves, it didn't lose any of its former glory. The Wind Empress. "You are." Brando didn't understand why the Wind Empress appeared in such a splendid attire. Was she trying to intimidate the she-wolf? It seemed that the Saint Ossoul he knew was not such a superficial person. "Ha!" Dark Cohua looked at the Wind Empress and let out a surprised sigh. "It really is the legacy of those guys in the Tower of Babel. I didn't expect to see it in this era." "What do you mean?" Brando interrupted her. "Brando," the Wind Empress took the initiative to continue the conversation. "Do you remember what I said to you last time?" "Last time?" "That time when you accepted Odin's inheritance. You said..." Brando suddenly remembered the conversation at that time. "At that time, you said that what you did, and what Odin did, after thousands of years, may not be clearly defined by right or wrong. It's nothing more than different methods that lead to different endings." As if a bolt of lightning flashed through his mind, he immediately reacted. "It turns out that the Dark Dragon chose the wrong path, and we may not be right," Saint Ossoul interrupted Brando. In fact, after the last battle, we have already expected today's result. But why? Brando looked at the Wind Empress in confusion. Is what Master Tolman said true? This has to do with a legend, Brando. The Elf Empress looked at Ko Hua silently and replied faintly. That was the time when the Night of Azure had not yet pierced through the sky and caused the meteors to fall to the ground, thus beginning the era of mortals. It was the time before the chaos. In that era described in countless hymns, the gods walked on the earth, and the earth was full of the gods' people, the silver race. The warriors of the gods, the golden race. And before them, there were even more glorious gods and servants. Under the glory of the gods, the earth was full of gold and jade, and the sweet water flowed in the rivers. The gods guided their people to cultivate and reproduce on this fertile land. The fire of civilization was prosperous and strong, and the silver race built countless miracles on the earth. The towers pierced the clouds, the cities floated above the clouds, the temples were piled up with jade, and the holy music in the temples was heard all year round. But in fact, the war history in the Pale poem told a completely different story. It was an era of war, bloodshed, and heroic sacrifice. In that era, the gods and their servants also faced a terrible enemy, the Twilight Dragon. Countless battles, countless reconstructions on the ruins, and civilization collapsed several times. And in the last era, the Twilight Dragon even captured the most powerful fortress of the Silver Race, Babel's Tower. The darkness of civilization. This was the terrible disaster recorded in the Pale poem of the Cruise people, recorded on the war slate, and recorded in the Dark Prophecy. Countless civilizations were destroyed, and the legacy of the past was scattered on the earth. After countless years, the once noble Silver Race had to trudge on the earth, cut through the thorns, and find everything that was lost. Until a hero appeared in this world. The Night of Azure. The legend that changed everything. After the azure spear pierced the sky and caused the Twilight Dragon to fall into a deep sleep, the Myrnas appeared on the earth. A prophet led them across the Great Plains and built the first civilized empire after the gods left Wone in the wilderness of today's four-leaf clover. This was the Myrnas Empire, and this was the beginning of the era of mortals. And that prophet, he had no name, but the legend about him was passed down from generation to generation. Because since then, every generation of Myrnas had a prophet, and they had a common name, the Dark Dragon. Chapter 981. When the Dark Dragon passed down to Odin's generation, the civilization and rule of the Myrnas had reached its peak. However, under the prosperity, there was a disharmony. At that time, the main characters of the land were not the Black Iron folk who now ruled Wone. They were just barbarians in the mountains, and the main members of the Black Iron folk, humans and mountain dwarves, were the vassals of the Myrnas. The Myrnas were very indifferent to the Black Iron folk, especially when the Dark Dragon reached Odin's generation. The empire was tyrannical and harsh to its vassals. Odin once conquered the humans on the Great Plains, built a fortress on the glacier, and migrated the dwarves to the Cloud Mountains. These two migrations alone caused the dwarves and humans to lose nearly half of their population. If the Myrnas were like this to their vassals, it was needless to say to the other Black Iron folk. It was usually a bloody suppression. They did not care about other races besides the Black Iron folk. At that time, the Silver Elves and the Mist Elves had their own kingdoms. Although most of them were isolated from the world, they still could not avoid dealing with the outside world. However, the Myrnas were high and mighty and ignored these silver folk. They only looked up to the Bugha who built a city on the shining coast. These wizards were said to be the guardians of the Tower of Babel, the descendants of the scholars of Aegido. As for the dragons, they were in the midst of the famous chaos of Aegido. They had no time to care about other things, let alone deal with the outside world. The Myrnas were getting more and more arrogant, and their rule was getting harsher and harsher. Finally, one day, the conflicts erupted like a volcano. Just as recorded in history, the opportunity came from Odin ordering the Mist Elves to work with the Myrnas to participate in the crusade against the barbarians. This order deeply hurt the sensitive and proud self-esteem of the Mist Elves, so they naturally rejected this unreasonable request without mercy. Odin was furious and immediately ordered sabers to lead an army to attack the Laurel Forest where the Mist Elves' kingdom was located. The fuse of the War of the Holy Saints, the UUA war between the Myrnas and the Mist Elves began. He had no choice but to be angry. At this point, the Wind Empress sighed to herself. Odin is a smart man. He saw the internal conflicts of the Empire. He wanted to use our submission to intimidate others, but he didn't expect that we would dare to refuse. Odin is too impatient, Brando thought with a frown. When he received the inheritance of the Dark Dragon, he had seen the Emperor of the Myrna people once in a dream. At that time, the impression that the other party had given him was not that of a headstrong person, but when he was trying to figure out the mentality of the elves, he made a huge mistake. The Silver Folk also had their own pride. The Mist Elves were not vassals of the Myrna people, so how could they bow down to the Myrna people? Saint Tossol saw his expression and knew what he was thinking. She shook her head and said, "The will of the Dark Dragon isn't that easy to reject. You can't imagine how powerful the Myrna people were in that era. Brando, you know that the Silver Elves are brave and good at fighting, but they might not even be able to win against the Myrna people, let alone us." "Then you?" Brando asked, puzzled. "We got a hint in advance." The Wind Empress replied word by word. "What?" "We got the promise of the Buga people," the Wind Empress said slowly. "In fact, the dissatisfaction with the Myrna people on the continent has been going on for a long time. Needless to say, in the Empire, the Silver Elves and the Mist Elves were not willing to be marginalized. The promise of the Buga people was like an opportunity for us. Soon, the Silver Elves joined this secret covenant. Coincidentally, as if fate had arranged it, at this time, the human resistance army that was suppressed by the Myrna people also crossed the wilderness under the leadership of the Flame King Gretel and returned to Wonde. Today, in the White Stone Wilderness, we signed the covenant that has been passed down to the present, which is the oath you call the Sacred Covenant. From then on, the War of the Holy Saints began. You know what happened after that?" Brando heard this and did not ask, because he knew that this was the history he was familiar with. Today, what the elven lady was going to tell him must be another, unknown secret. Sure enough, after a moment of silence, the Wind Empress spoke again. "But in fact, there are several suspicious points in the whole War of the Holy Saints. The biggest question is, later, we privately confirmed with the Buga people that the reason they participated in the war was because they got the promise of the dragon, and before that, they did not send any invitation to us. As for the dragon side, the situation is similar." Brando raised his eyebrows, faintly smelling the scent of a conspiracy from this paragraph. The Flame King Gretel, under mysterious guidance, crossed the dark wilderness. In the early years, Gretel, Fanzin and I used to adventure on the continent together. Although we lost contact after he became the leader of the resistance army, I believe that he would not lie about this. Besides, Fanzin and Eloranta had similar experiences. In other words, behind the War of the Holy Saints, there is actually a force behind it, and this force does not belong to any side of the humans, elves, wizards, or dragons. Brando finally could not help but stop and ask. The Wind Empress also stopped. This former sage looked out at the vast and blue sea outside the corridor, her light purple eyes flashing with an inexplicable brilliance. "Yes, in fact, I met that person later. She was called Sophie, a witch." "Witch? Witch?" Although before this, Brando's mind had all kinds of answers, but he never thought of this special group of witches. They were the loyal followers of the Dark Dragon, and even today, even in open opposition to the world of order, they did not give up their beliefs. Needless to say, the Queen of Witches was the former mistress of the Myrna Empire. How could such a group betray the Myrna people? The Wind Empress nodded. This group of witches is from the Pharaoh. They and the witches of the 13th moon are the two most unique groups of witches in the witch world. Sophie is not her name. Every generation of their orthodox descendants is called Sophie, just like the Dark Dragon. After the War of the Holy Saints ended, she personally found me and told me all this. Why? Brando asked, very puzzled. Because of the Black Prophecy. Black Prophecy. The Wind Empress skipped this question and asked, Brando, do you think someone as smart as Odin would fall into the trap of his own people? Could it be because he trusted the witches too much? No, that's not the case. After thinking about it carefully, I'm afraid he already knew all this. When we rebelled, even if the humans, dwarves, elves, and Bugis, as well as a few other races such as the gnomes and halflings joined together, I'm afraid we weren't sure if we could really defeat the Empire. The strength of the Myrna people is unimaginable to people now. This was the second time she said this, but in the eyes of Saint Hassel, it seemed to be a matter of course, because the Myrna Empire ruled by the Dark Dragon was so frightening. But they were defeated after all. Brando comforted. No. The Wind Empress shook her head decisively. It's not as simple as you think, Brando. From the beginning to the end, only Sabers and Tumen's legions participated in suppressing our rebellion. Sabers belongs to the Dark Dragon's forbidden army, and Tumen's is just some militia. The Myrna people have 7 legions, and these 7 legions have never appeared in the entire War of the Holy Saints. What? This time, Brando was really surprised. It could be explained that the 7 legions of the Myrna people did not appear in the early stages of the War of the Holy Saints because they did not attract attention. But after the decisive battle between the 4 sages and sabers, anyone with a discerning eye could see that the Myrna Empire had reached its end at that time, and even the Dark Dragon Odin himself had to participate in the battle. Under such circumstances, the possibility of the Myrna people still hiding their strength was too small, unless the so-called 7 legions of the Myrna people were just a complete scam. But, is that possible? The Wind Empress continued, in fact, until we attacked the Alkash region, we had always thought that the Dark Dragon had arranged a trap to make us believe that we had won. The only doubt was that most people more or less felt that our strength was not enough to make Odin go to war. It wasn't until Odin personally participated in the final battle and was defeated that we dared to believe that all of this was true. In fact, until the final battle, Odin had not used his strongest strength. She paused for a moment. You are also a planeswalker, Brando. Do you know what kind of power a planeswalker possesses? That is extraordinary power, the power of a world. This power has its own system in the world of planeswalkers, and it is on a completely different level from the power that we possess, whether it is magic or physical strength. Unless we can use the power of the entire world to fight against the power of the planeswalkers, it is impossible for us to win. To put it simply, a planeswalker is actually a god. He is like a god who came here from a distant world. He controls all the rules of that world, and the creatures and forces of the entire world obey his orders unconditionally. If we want to fight against him, we have to become the god of our world first. But as everyone knows, the god of our world has long been away from the disputes of the mortal world. So, in theory, it is impossible for us to win against Odin. But planeswalkers also need to plunder resources. He can't squander his power without limit. Odin just changed his method of plundering power from this world to support the power of his world. As long as you find a way to defeat him from this source, it's not like there's no hope of victory. In fact, isn't that what you're doing, Lady Wind Empress? You are the same as us in that era, thinking of the problem too simply. But the problem is, the Dark Dragon is not alone. He can seize power from us, and he can also seize power from others. As a dignified emperor of an empire, with so many people supporting him, would he really fight against us alone? Saint Tassel seemed to have been prepared for this question, and calmly retorted. Brando was stunned. He remembered that this was not what the Wind Empress had said last time. Moreover, history did not describe it this way. But he did come to challenge you alone. Is it because he is too confident? Odin is no longer a young boy. He is the supreme of a huge empire. He would not do something reckless for this false reputation. Actually, Fanzon and I saw some clues in the battle. Later, before Odin died, he asked us to keep a secret for him, which confirmed my guess. He asked you. For sages to keep a secret for him. What kind of secret is that? Brando only realized that it was inappropriate when he asked this question, and hurriedly tried to remedy it. Sorry, I mean. If it is not convenient, then forget it. He suddenly thought that since the Wind Empress had said this, the four sages must have agreed to Odin's request at that time. Some of the things that Tumen had said to him before also proved this point. In that case, he could not let the Wind Empress be a person who went back on her words. Besides, heroes like the four sages were unlikely to go back on their words. But unexpectedly, the Wind Empress shook her head indifferently and said, Actually, it's nothing. I came out today to tell you the truth. I've thought about it. Since you are the person chosen by Odin, there are some things that you should know. Brando shut his mouth, but frowned faintly. He suddenly heard a sense of farewell from the tone of the Elf Empress. He faintly felt that the sage who had accompanied him for so long and taken care of him like an elder was about to choose to leave. Saint Tassel pondered for a moment before slowly replying, The secret that he asked us to keep is very simple. It is to let the result of the War of the Holy Saints become an established fact. In fact, he had already expected all of this. He told us some things. The Twilight Dragon has never really died. The first generation of the Dark Dragon, Azure Knight, only seriously injured it and made it return to the Sea of Chaos. However, the hour hand of the Judgment Day has never slowed down. There is such a legend in the Dark Prophecy. It says that a hero will be born from the mortals, holding the key of fate and opening another door for the future of this world. That is the rebirth of order on the ashes after the dusk of all things and gods. After the disaster of Babel Fortress, civilization was once lost on the earth. Many people, including our generation, thought that the hero among the mortals was Azure Knight. Because he was the one who made the stars fall to the earth and started the era of mortals. However, fate played a cruel joke on us. This is a secret that only a few people know. Since the establishment of the Myrna Empire, they have been engaged in a fierce war with the Twilight Army outside the elemental frontier. Therefore, Wonde had a short respite. The Elf Queen smiled slightly, but her smile was a little tired. We thought that what we did was right. The War of the Holy Saints was just a war against oppression. However, from the beginning, we guessed the beginning correctly, but not the end. Unfortunately, it was our own people who gave the Dark Dragon a fatal blow. At the last moment of the dynasty's collapse, Odin ordered the 7 legions to be permanently stationed outside the elemental frontier. He also joined forces with several other planeswalkers to seal Wonde's passage to the Sea of Chaos. This was his last gift to us. He was a stupid guy, but this gift was precious. This gift exhausted the strength of him and everyone around him, so it became the reason for his inevitable failure. The Wind Empress sighed softly. In fact, this was also the reason why the witches betrayed him. Odin did not believe in fate. Everything he wanted to do was just to prove that everything said in the Black Prophecy was not necessarily right. The world did not need to be destroyed to be reborn, and there was never a savior. But the witches believed in the power of prophecy. The end of the world was bound to come. Odin had proved that he was not the person in the prophecy, so the Myrna people had to give up this stage for the Iron Folk. They were waiting for the arrival of the final prophecy in the Black Prophecy. The witches of the Moon of Law were the executors of this prophecy. Brando was speechless for a long time. He had already guessed part of the truth, but it was only today that it was confirmed. This was the inheritance of the fool. It was the arrogant struggle of a man who overestimated himself. Although it was ridiculous, it was worth remembering forever. Because people would never bow down to fate. Now that the truth was out, he couldn't help but rub his chest. In a sense, he was also the one who had overestimated his capabilities. Whether it was in the eyes of the noble heroine, in the eyes of the princess, or in the eyes of others, perhaps even the Bugis who supported him behind the scenes, or even the people around him, they might not be able to understand his ideals. He knew that many people stood by him only because they believed that he could change something. They might not agree with his true thoughts deep in his heart. What did he want the world to be like? Brando did not answer, but his eyes had already crossed the sublime inland sea. He knew that there, beyond the borders of civilization, there were countless undeveloped lands. Civilization did not have to be trapped in one place, and the power of the twilight was not invincible. These thoughts were somewhat out of tune with this world that was deeply mired in chaos, perhaps even too distant. Just like how the Kurlutz people would never work together with the Farnasan people, the Wind Elves would never be able to integrate themselves into the human world without reservation, not to mention the undead and countless troubles and conflicts. But would he become a fool like Odin? Brando felt that he could not answer this question for a while. Maybe, maybe not, just like how he did not agree with all of Odin's ideas. Maybe the problem is not here. He said slowly. The glorious deeds of the four sages, the alliance of the continent's 100 races, may not be a mistake. Odin may be doing what he thinks is right, but there are many ways to accomplish one thing. He believes that fate can be changed, but he sees himself as the savior. Brando looked at the magnificent scenery under the fleet. The thick clouds scattered like cotton were blown away by the wind, revealing the golden sea surface. But there were more things in his mind. The diligent Blackie has published a new book again. Let me recommend it to everyone. I feel that it has improved a lot compared to the last book. Title, Ling Tinji, Book Number 3296695. Introduction. With a thought, 10,000 laws follow. With a thought, the moon is bright and the wind is clear. The 9 states is vast, hundreds of millions of miles. The Emperor of Great Zhou appoints the world to the people. The Taoist court is above the 9 heavens, educating the 9 states. Outside the 9 states, the demon kingdom of the northern wilderness is eyeing covetously. The southern barbarian shaman sect is ambitious. The Saha Buddhist land in the west preaches to the 9 states and is in the ascendant. A young scholar who has read all kinds of classics since childhood transmigrates to this world. He fights the barbarian shaman and fights the demons. He discusses the Tao with the Bodhisattva and smiles with the Taoist lord. He builds the heavenly court, establishes the netherworld, opens the 6 paths of reincarnation, and becomes the celestial emperor. Chapter 982. The two stood in the corridor and did not speak for a long time. Brando suddenly spoke. Lady Wind Empress, I have one last question. Is it about the secret of the final battlefield? The Wind Empress seemed to have expected this question. Yes, I want to know what the Silver Empress saw in that temple and why there was a Somir crystal there. According to what you said, since Odin asked you to keep it a secret for him, why would he leave a message there? I think there must be a reasonable answer behind all this. The Wind Empress was silent for a moment. I think this may be an accident, but maybe not. That human girl may have seen the node there and saw something outside our world through the node. Node? This is the biggest secret of the final battle. Why did the final battle move around the entire Alkash region? It's all because of us. It's all because of us, because Odin's seal of the entire world, and the node of the seal is located in the center of the final battlefield, which is in that temple. I suspect that someone deliberately let that human girl see what is behind the seal. This person may be the Darkness Dragon, or may not be. If it's not the Darkness Dragon. Brando's voice lowered a little. Regarding the answer to this question, both of them tacitly did not continue, because other than the Darkness Dragon, there was only one force that had the motive to do so, and that was the Twilight Dragon. The hidden message behind this was too terrifying, to the point that Brendel could not help but tremble in fear. The Bugis may have also guessed this. The Wind Empress paused for a moment before replying. They may have originally hoped that the Holy Cathedral of Fire would stand on their side, but Vala's performance undoubtedly disappointed them, so they came to you. This is also the reason why you must stop Her Majesty the Empress. I understand. Brando nodded. In fact, even if it was not for this reason, just for Scarlet, it was enough for him to stand on the opposite side of Her Majesty the Empress. There was another long period of silence. It was as if the past of the War of the Holy Saints was always shrouded in a layer of fog and seemed mysterious and unfathomable until the truth was known. But when all the truth was revealed, it made people speechless. It was as if both of them understood that there was no need to continue the discussion on this issue. After a long time, Saint Hassol said faintly, Brando, actually, I'm here to bid you farewell. Hearing this unexpected sentence, Brando was not surprised. He just took a deep breath and asked, Are you going back to Saint Hassol, Lady Wind Empress? The Wind Empress nodded. The time has come. We have guarded the secret for Odin for 1,000 years, and the seal he and Kelsey left behind is getting weaker and weaker. Now that the demonic wave is coming, the connection between the Sea of Chaos and Wound has reached its closest point in 1,000 years. The power of Twilight is recovering, and the demon's restlessness proves this point. Therefore, I must return to Saint Hassol. In fact, I have already guessed the reason why the Bugis came to you. I also don't agree with the choice of the human empress. Her choice is just repeating the old path that the Darkness Dragon has walked once, and it is impossible to succeed. Go ahead and do it, Brando, the Wind Elves will support you. Brando was silent. He knew the temperament of the Wind Empress, and it was meaningless to persuade her to stay. Are you ready, Lady Wind Empress? The Saint Hassol of today is no longer the same as before. Of course I know, but there are some things that I have to do, little guy, because there is only one Saint Hassol in this world. Yes, there is only one Saint Hassol in this world. The Mist Elves may no longer exist, but the national emblem of the Elven Empire is still the Wind Empress' sacred emblem. This is the meaning of motherland and homeland, not to mention that it is the country that she founded. No matter what she said, Brando knew in his heart that the Sage Empress would never truly let go of her people. 1,000 years have passed, and this feeling has become deeper and deeper. I am not unprepared. Including the hunter's siblings, more than half of the knight by my side back then have gathered, and I also know the whereabouts of some others. The 24 rings symbolize the national emblem of Saint Hassol, and soon people will understand that this is actually just a symbolic meaning. Only then did Brando remember the hunter's siblings that he saved in the deadly frost forest. The girl who was as agile as a cheetah had left a deep impression on him, and the two of them had stayed in Valhalla after that incident. He was silent for a while, but he was still very reluctant to part with them. Ever since he first met the Elven Empress under the Schaflund silver mine, it seemed that a long time had passed unknowingly. He did not know when it started, but he had gradually gotten used to having this kind of person who was both a teacher and a friend, like a big sister next door. She was once a sage, but also his teacher. Although he had long been honed into a true man, he still felt melancholy in his heart. The Wind Empress looked at him, and a series of words like a nightingale's voice blurted out, "That's Vin my Aster." This was an elven proverb, and the general idea was that one day, even a cub would have to leave the nest. Brando understood what she meant, and just as he was about to say something, the Wind Empress continued, "Brando, do you still remember the first time we met?" Brando froze for a moment. He naturally remembered that it was under the Schaflund silver mine, and everything that happened back then was still fresh in his mind. He was much more impulsive than he was now, causing a lot of trouble in the Abbeys, but he also got to know many people because of it. Jutta, Cornelius, and Rabin were now his capable subordinates. Although Coden was already retired in Menta, he still acted as a link between him and the old nobles. There was also Odin, the bad-tempered old dwarf who was now in charge of the construction of Valhalla Fortress. There were also the youths under the Shire, Lyrian, Morkan, and many others who had left their status as apprentices and became true wizards. There were also some who joined his fleet and became young captains. Now that he thought about it, that was the beginning of his career. It was also the beginning of him becoming the Lord of Erewhon. After that, he had experienced many things, and under the guidance of the sage, he was now much more mature and learned more about the secrets of this world. He was no longer the brat of the past, but a true lord. The past experiences and troubles had now become a heavy memory. In the end, there was only one image left in his mind. It was the mountains of Yusong. The starry night hung low, and the mountains were silent. The rolling hills were undulating, and a lone building stood in the midst of the pine trees. In the dark night, the cold moonlight flowed like water into the corridor. It was a fake oil painting, a knight's sword shining with cold light, a young man covered in blood, and a shining ring. That was the beginning of everything. Inside and outside the Lion Palace, a heavy rain dominated the night in the center of the empire. Under the deep dome, Vala wore a red holy robe and held a golden scepter that represented the golden holy flame. The increasingly old great priest today bent his body and looked at the woman in front of him with turbid eyes. The Silver Queen wore a black dress with a beautiful white rose pinned on her chest, as if she was wearing a funeral dress. She sneered as she looked at the sacred hall. There was a hint of condescension in her smile, as if the indisputable majesty and holiness of the sacred hall were nothing but dust in her eyes. A bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, passing through the wooden grids of the large arched window that hung down to the ground. It was like a print depicting disaster and the end of the world, illuminating the faces of everyone in the great sage hall with snow-white light. The light of the candles was only a weak ball in the white rainy night. It was not until the lightning zigzagged away from the sky that the hall was once again enveloped in warm light. But Vala's heart was cold. Shadows were gathering outside the arched window like silent ghosts. Flecks of red light flickered in the darkness, coming closer and closer, gradually converging into a torrent. Vala raised her head shakily and saw all this. The wild beasts covered in manes, baring their fangs and sharp teeth, were leaping from rooftops far and near, raising their heads and letting out a long howl or two. In the distance, echoing screams were heard from farther blocks. Even though it was raining, cats and dogs all over the city were screaming crazily in the night. Everything was like the scene before the end of the world. Vala's heart was cold. Those were the sinners, the werewolves of Senia, the last people with the blood of the Myrnas. And today, they were back. One by one, the figures overlapped in front of him. The once tall and glorious statues of the sages that he yearned for, after the terrible upheaval, the sacred light that shrouded them gradually dissipated. One by one, the lights went out, and the road ahead was finally plunged into a dark fog. It was a scene he had witnessed in the past few decades. He had seen with his own eyes the sacred hall that was full of vigor and vitality slowly fade away. The people's unwavering faith gradually wavered, and they fell into a desperate state of self-doubt. The road ahead was long gone, and everything was over. He suddenly remembered the moment when he received the holy crown and the scepter. At that time, the golden sun shrouded the entire Leo Palace, and the spire of the palace shone with the most dazzling light. But that was just before sunset. When the Senia Bolton woke up from his nightmare, purple lightning zigzagged across the sky. Outside the window, it was raining cats and dogs. He was lying on a thin wooden bed, his face snow-white from the illumination of the lightning. "Sifrid." He subconsciously called out, but there was no response. He stared blankly for a moment before remembering that his daughter had already moved to Valhalla, where she was learning how to grasp the power of the forest goddess from the druid elders. All that was left in the land of darkness was the rustling of the rain. Occasionally, white lightning flashed, but Bolton felt a little uneasy. There was no moon in the rainy night, but he seemed to be able to hear a strong call in his heart. It was the wild instinct in the Senia bloodline. Usually, this most primitive desire for destruction would only be aroused under the brilliance of the magic moon, but today was a little abnormal. He slowly sat up on the bed and listened to the movements outside. After Grodin's death, the entire green village was moved to this place under the young lord's arrangements. It was located in the middle of the mountains and forests. He could usually hear the sound of the wind rising and falling under the night sky, but on this rainy night, he could only hear one or two howls that pierced through the curtain of rain. He did not know if it was the wolves of the forest or some other beast. Bolton was speechless. Amidst the faint uneasiness, he suddenly recalled the strange dream he had. It was said that when a person woke up from a dream, the memory of the dream would be particularly deep. For him, this was exactly the case. The most terrifying scenes in the dream replayed repeatedly in his mind. The scenes in the dream were strange and absurd, but he vaguely felt that they were somewhat real. He saw a sea of fire descending, the earth cracking, stars piercing through the clouds and falling from the sky. The mountains and rivers were flattened, and the sea was steaming. The whole world was falling apart and turning into ashes. A terrifying dragon stretched across the starry sky, watching Wone's destruction with a cold gaze. In that hellish scene, he seemed to hear the wails of countless people. His people, his daughter, they were all buried in the sea of fire. Then, all the scenes collapsed. He remembered a tall figure standing in front of him, ordering him to pledge his loyalty with an unquestionable tone. Thousands of voices echoed in his mind, turning into a loud rumble. The dark dragon has been resurrected, the times have changed. Obey her orders. Obey her orders. Asterisk bang. Asterisk Bolton's eyes were red. He suddenly slammed his fist on the bed. He roared in a low voice, suppressing the urge to turn into a wolf. When he woke up the next moment, his head was already covered in cold sweat, and a deep fear rose from his heart. This primitive and fatal impulse was the biggest weakness of the Senia people, but usually, only when the power of the demon moon was at its peak would he feel this wild power and his blood become restless. What was going on? He took 2 deep breaths, but before he could calm the uneasiness in his heart, the door was pushed open with a loud bang. A young man who was drenched stood outside the door, looking at him in panic. He said, "Uncle Bolton, it's not good. Something big has happened." The young man's face was pale, and he looked like he was out of his wits. Ah. Myrna came to the village. She said her name is Sue. Sophie. She's a witch. A bright flash of lightning pierced through the window and into the depths of Scarlet's orange-red eyes. She looked up and was surprised to see the woman who suddenly appeared in front of her. It was the statue of the Saintess of the Lion Palace, wearing a holy robe and covered in blood. On the balcony on the 3rd floor of the castle, Sidney Metferica stood in the rain. At this moment, there were 3 deep wounds on her face. The blood had long dried up, and the wound was washed white by the rain. One of her eyes was squinted because of the severe injury, but this did not change the woman's cold and almost stiff expression. Her remaining one-eyed angel, Iroma, was still burning fiercely and coldly staring at Scarlet. Although there were many wounds and blood stained her robe, Scarlet had an illusion that the blood on the woman in front of her was far less than that of her enemy. But at this moment in the capital of the Empire, How could such a battle happen? She had heard of the woman's reputation and knew that the enemy who could hurt her like this must not be simple. If such an enemy appeared in the central area controlled by the crew's people, then the Empire would not have many days to live. So, it could only be an internal conflict of the Empire. Scarlet vaguely guessed something in an instant. After these days of nurturing, she had begun to have a political mind. She was no longer the confused and restless little girl. Besides, these days, the Silver Queen had strictly limited the number of times she and the maids went out. This action implied a signal. The situation in the Empire had been tense day by day. The Queen had already made her move. It seemed that her target was the Holy Sanctum. But Scarlet still did not understand why the statue of the Saintess of the Lion Palace appeared here, in front of her. While Scarlet was puzzled, Sydney was also thinking. It was not the first time she had seen this charming mountain girl. She had recently been conferred the title of Countess and the title of Mountain Princess. But Sydney understood that this was not the true purpose of the stubborn queen. She wanted the mountain people to marry a real princess of the Empire, so that they could be tied to the queen's chariot. It was a pity that the little girl was still at a loss. Scarlet opened her mouth slightly as if she wanted to ask something, but in the end, she could not make a sound. "I'm here to find you." Sydney interrupted her with a slightly cold voice. "Her Majesty intends to marry you to Prince Hamur to consolidate her relationship with the mountain people and ensure that you can stay in the Empire." Scarlet was slightly startled at first, then she reacted and clenched her fists. The mountain girl bit her lower lip. Although she did not speak, her expression was enough to show her thoughts. "It seems that you don't agree. You want me to help you. You can take me away." "No, I can't protect myself, but I want to see your lord. I need you to introduce me. I can help you pass a message." Scarlet stared at her closely. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the torrential rain and the sound of the rain washing the stone wall could be heard. After a long time, the mountain girl hesitated. It was only for a moment, but Sydney had already seen her mouth. There were only 6 words: "Save me, Lord." Why do students always say that I'm a monthly update? In the future, I'll be a young gentleman who never stops updating. Continue to recommend Hey 13th's new work, Ling Tinji. If you can help recommend and collect it, please help. Chapter 983. After passing through the storm, the temperament of the sublime inland sea became unusually mild. A week later, at noon of the 8th day to be exact, a black arc appeared on the horizon where the sky and sea were the same color as the sea. It was the mountains of Metz. The sailors remeasured the position of the fleet and confirmed that they were in the waters near Fathom 10. In fact, the Imperial patrol ships with red sails could already be seen on the sea level. This Imperial patrol ship came from the nearby Fathom 10 port. The sailors on the ship were obviously frightened when they saw a huge fleet coming out of the clouds in the afternoon sun. They were in a flurry for a while before they sent out a signal and asked who they were. They usually ask what the wind message spell when they get close. Sometimes they also use flag signals. "They should be warning the port now," Ivram explained in a muffled voice as he stood by the bow of the ship. Brando nodded and responded faintly, "Tell them our identity." "Did you see clearly what they said?" Hellman, the captain of the Imperial patrol ship, turned around and asked his second-in-command. The drunken old man was already half sober from the shock. He threw away the wine bottle, took the brass binoculars, and looked at the unfamiliar fleet in front of him shakily. "They said, they are the fleet of the Bugis," the first-in-command replied with trepidation. "What, the Bugis? What are they doing here? Are you sure you're not mistaken?" "Sir, I'm sure I'm not mistaken, unless they are using the wrong flag signal." "Then what do you think?" Hellman touched his unshaven chin. This is the fleet of the Bugis. The first in command stared at the sea of sails shining like silver scales on the clouds. His expression was complicated, but he still nodded honestly. It was the one and only fleet in the world, the fleet of the Silver City. The nominal owner of Fathom Harbor, Baron Ludwig Metz, was a little restless in his office today. Just a quarter of an hour ago, the men he sent finally figured out the origin of the fleet that suddenly appeared at his doorstep. It was really the fleet of the Bugis, and it was said that they had encountered the air force of the Jordandy Ridge south of Lone Harbor and fought once. It seemed that these Bugis were actually allies of the Empire. However, the wizards rarely intervened in mortal wars. Even in the previous Holy War, they watched coldly from the sidelines. Baron Metz did not understand why the other party suddenly changed their attitude, but at least they brought news of the Evergreen Corridor south of the Evergreen Corridor, and the noble refugees, which could not be faked. His second-in-command also said that he saw Earl Alcorn and a few other leading figures among the refugees. With these people as witnesses, Baron Metz did not think that the other party was faking it. However, seeing the huge fleet docked in the harbor, Baron Ludwig Metz could not help but be a little worried. He was not worried about anything else, but how long these wizards would stay here. It was not a simple matter to support the logistics of such a huge fleet. Even if the other party was self-sufficient, with so many warships flooding into the harbor, it was inevitable that the harbor would be affected. Not to mention other things, just the number of berths alone was reduced by more than half, and all of that was money. On the other hand, as the lord of a city, Baron Metz was also respected in the Empire, but after all, the other party was a silver person, and had unknowingly surpassed the ordinary people. The Empire had always boasted of being the center of civilization, but this center was usually limited to the area under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Even Fanzon and Saint Tossel might not be respected, let alone other places. Nowadays, most people advocated civilization and order, and it was well known that most of the civilizations of this era were inherited from the previous era, and many had been lost in the flames of war, not to mention the priceless ancient documents stored in Babel Tower before the Battle of Dusk. In this regard, the Silver people had an innate advantage over the Black Iron civilization, not to mention the craftsman wizards who boasted of being the keepers of knowledge. Therefore, in the eyes of the world of this era, the arrogant and isolated Bugis were simply synonymous with glory and civilization, born to be high and mighty. Among the ordinary nobles, the culture of the Silver City-state was very much admired, especially in the territories of the major empires, to the extent that it had almost reached a morbid level of subservience to culture. Although Baron Ludwig Metz was pragmatic and was not the kind of hardcore Bugis admirer, but as a member of the high-ranking noble circle, it was inevitable that he would be affected. When he thought of having to deal with those white-robed, gentle craftsman wizards in the clouds, for a moment, he felt a little uneasy in his heart. If Brando knew that an excuse he casually made up could give rise to such a mentality in an imperial noble who had been on the battlefield for a long time, he wondered if he would laugh his head off. But at least he would never believe that there were any gentle craftsman wizards. When he was a player, he had stayed in the Silver City-state for quite a long time, and the wizards he had seen were generally of two kinds, either very pragmatic, or similar to science fanatics. The former were mostly from the Silver Council, and the latter were mostly from the Silver Society. At this moment, the Baron was thinking about what kind of attitude he should use to meet these noble guests later. Suddenly, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He raised his head, and the office door was suddenly pushed open with a creak. This change made Baron Ludwig Metz frown slightly, thinking that these Southerners really did not know etiquette. They pushed the door open without waiting for the announcement. He did not expect that it would be the Bugis who came in from outside. In his opinion, the Silver folk should be much more civilized than the people on the ground, and certainly would not do such a rude thing. As soon as the door opened, Baron Ludwig Metz did not see the silver-robed Bugis wizards, but what made his eyes widen was a group of soldiers in armor, blue battle robes, and halberds. These soldiers were certainly not his subordinates, because he had seen them come straight up to him and pointed their spears at him from left and right. "You are..." Baron Ludwig Metz was stunned for a moment before he finally found the origin of this military uniform in the deepest part of his mind. His expression changed several times, and finally he blurted out, "Erwin's men." It was Erwin's men. Unfortunately, Baron Ludwig Metz realized it a little late. In fact, this was exactly what Brando wanted to achieve. He used the Bugis fleet as a cover, hoping to make the people in Fathom Harbor lower their guard. Fortunately, the fleet itself was built by the Bugis, and the warships themselves followed the consistent style of the wizards. In addition, Count Alcorn and others on the ship testified, even if the crew's people wanted to be suspicious, it would be quite difficult. Things developed as he expected, and the fleet entered the port without any hindrance. After the warships docked, the soldiers on the warships rushed down to remove the weapons in the hands of the crew's harbor guards. Those guys still could not believe that the Bugis wizards would suddenly turn hostile and attack them. After all, in their opinion, the Silver Folk did not care about what happened in the mortal world at all. Worldly power was like a fleeting cloud to them. Thousands of years of tradition had almost formed a kind of inertia, and this inertia allowed Brando to build a great advantage. He commanded the Shire, Eugenie, Marjorie, Ivram, and others to take over the entire harbor, and then personally led a team directly to the castle where Baron Ludwig Metz was located. They did not encounter any resistance along the way, and even the castle guards personally opened the gate for them. When they were forced to have their weapons confiscated, they were stunned and asked these Erwin's men what they wanted to do. But when these people finally realized that they were not facing the Bugis, but Erwin's men, they showed a similar look to Ludwig Metz himself. First, they were shocked and could not believe it, then they were shocked and could not believe it. For these people, Brando did not have time to answer their doubts for the time being. With a wave of his hand, they were all locked up in the dungeon under the castle. In this way, almost without any trouble, he and his fleet took over the harbor. Of course, this was only temporary. After all, he was just an outsider. If he wanted to rule such a huge city, it was definitely not enough to rely on the few Aween people in his hands. At most, he could only capture the upper echelons in one fell swoop. As for the lower echelons, he did not have the time nor the ability to capture all of them. Moreover, even if he had the ability to do so, who would manage this city for him after he locked them all up in the dungeon? In order to make such a huge port work, the amount of manpower needed was not small. Fortunately, he did not only have Erwin's men in his hands, but also a considerable number of crew's nobles. These people were all prominent figures in the empire. With these people in his hands, he could justifiably take over the city under the pretext of military control. The empire was in a state of internal and external troubles. On the east side of the Evergreen Corridor, the empire and the Wind Elves were locked in a fierce battle. On the south side, there was the sudden appearance of the Jorgendi Ridge army. Not to mention, a few days ago, the Lion Men of Toquinen finally captured the Anzaruta fortress group. It could be said that at this time, the situation in the south of the empire was in a deep quagmire, and even the Metz region was exposed. At this time, they were nominally allies of the empire. A Bugis fleet, after reaching a consensus with the nobles of the empire, was here to rest and help them fight against the Jorgendi Ridge army. It did not sound very strange. At this time, letting the nobles of the Southern Empire contact the middle-level officials would not give the crew's people in the harbor the illusion that they were occupied. It would make them feel that the harbor was still under the control of the empire, and this Bugis fleet was just a temporary amulet. Of course, to do all this, he must reach a consensus with Count Alcorn and the others. Brando had not thought about how to deal with these fleeing nobles. After all, taking over a harbor from an empire's governor sounded like a rebellion. For these fleeing nobles, they might not be willing to be on the same boat as him. But he did not expect that an empire merchant ship that they captured on the route would be of great help to him. At that time, he originally ordered the capture of the merchant ship because he was afraid that the other party would leak the news that such a huge fleet had appeared in the heart of the empire. But when they boarded the ship, they found that the bottom of the merchant ship was full of refugees from the heart of the empire. These refugees brought them unimaginable news. A civil war broke out. During the week they were sailing on the Sublime Sea, or to be exact, on the second day after they left Lone Harbor, the Kurlutz Empire underwent earth-shattering changes. Her Majesty the Queen suddenly took control of an army that had never appeared before. This army was composed of the Xenia and the Myernas. She directly deprived Vala of his authority as the Pope of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and announced a religious reform. A religious reform initiated by a secular monarch was simply a big joke. In the first moment, the churches in the empire were divided into two distinct factions. The School of Economics clearly stood on the side of Her Majesty the Queen, while the local faction loyal to Vala immediately raised the flag of rebellion after a short period of chaos. In short, the empire suddenly became a mess. This was not just an internal matter of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. This huge change of interests affected everyone's heart. The nobles of Cloak Bay responded to the call of the Silver Queen immediately, but the nobles of the north obviously could not accept this fact. In fact, at this time, the two sides had already fought in the east of Metz. Surprisingly, the traditional military nobles were defeated and suffered a big loss. Brando could not learn more from these refugees for a while. He only knew that the coalition forces formed by several lords retreated in the direction of Ludwig after losing. But these were not the main points. The real bombshell was, the Myernas were back. These survivors from the era of the Dark Dragon had finally risen from the ashes. When they heard the news, the supporters of Her Majesty the Queen, including Count Alcorn, could not believe it at first, then they doubted it. But after confirming it again and again, they fell into silence one by one. After all, this was still a world dominated by order after the War of the Holy Saints. No matter how unrestrained and rebellious they were, they dared not deny the justice of the four sages. This was the foundation of the Iron Folk and the noble ancestors. For a while, they could not figure out what happened to Her Majesty the Queen. Was she crazy? How dare she do this? But after a moment of silence, Brando knew that his opportunity had come. He hurriedly instilled his plan into the stunned nobles of the empire. In the case of an uncertain environment, it was best to stand firm first and then choose what to do next. It was probably because of such a huge change in the situation that these fleeing nobles no longer cared about such a small issue as taking over a port. Besides, Count Alcons and the others were not stupid. Of course, they knew what the best choice was when they were surrounded by powerful enemies and the situation was uncertain. As for Brando's actions of taking over the port, they unanimously chose to remain silent. But Brando actually understood that choosing to remain silent at this time was actually supporting him. As the dust settled on the affairs in the port, the tasks were assigned one by one. Brando stood in the original office of Baron Ludwig Metz. Through the floor-to-ceiling arched window, he saw that there was not much commotion in Fatham Port outside. Everything was still in order. Finally, he could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. This time, the Wizards of Bugha had given him a huge problem. Now, he had finally taken the most difficult first step. Fortunately, Tolman did not lie to him. Her Majesty the Queen had indeed taken action first. In this way, there were more options left for him. At least the interior of the empire was no longer a monolith. As for the matter of using the tiger's skin as a banner, Brando thought that the Wizards of Bugha would definitely not mind such a small matter. He could not help but think with some malice. These damn guys wanted to stay out of this matter, but he would not let them do as they wished. He wanted to let these wizards, who thought that they were superior, understand that there was a price to pay if they wanted to use him as a chess piece. He knocked on the table just in time to see the Shire pushing the door open and coming in from outside. The young wizard attendant looked at his lord with a strange expression and said, "My lord, the weather is good today. There are some unexpected gains in the port." Cut the crap. Brando's face stiffened, and then he was slightly stunned. Unexpected gains. Well, it's a big fish. Oh, no, it should be a little mermaid. What kind of nonsense is this? A mermaid? I thought it was a siren. Brando frowned and was about to say something, but the Shire already knew what he was going to say and quickly interrupted him with a smile. "I'm not talking nonsense, my lord. You'll know when you see it." The light that penetrated the darkness was the only connection between this huge moving cage and the outside world. It came from the air holes above, and this beam of light scattered diagonally in the dark environment. It fell on the floor not far from Vahina, forming a circular spot of light. Her hands and feet were shackled with ice-cold shackles. The shackles were not heavy, but they were inlaid with formations that could isolate magic power. She calculated day and night based on the changes in the position of the light spot and the food she had obtained. It had been almost a week since she had been locked up in this cage, and almost half a month had passed since she had been imprisoned in Wagner City. Thinking back to when she was first locked in this cage, she was furious and wanted nothing more than to kill that despicable Rodney. But as the days passed, she became numb to it. After the rage, she felt a deep sense of unease and fear. But what Vahina was most afraid of was not her own fate. After all, she was the student of the Green Sword Saint, Veronica. She would not kneel down and beg for mercy in order to survive. What she was most worried about was her family, her father, and her younger sister. If she still did not know who was behind this, then she would be a true idiot of a noble lady without the slightest bit of political intelligence. Chapter 984. After sorting out her thoughts, Vahina understood her situation. In the past week, the change in the time of sunset proved that they were heading north. There were a few times when she heard the sound of waves. There were a few mountain paths between Metz and the evergreen corridor that were close to the sea. This proved that the convoy was also heading west at the same time. It was very likely that the convoy was passing through a few provinces along the sublime inland sea in the west of Flower Leaf territory, heading to the port there and taking a ship to the imperial capital. Days passed by. Living in the dark was enough to drive a normal person crazy, not to mention the great fear buried in her heart. Most of the time, she bent her legs and buried her head in her knees. She hugged herself with both hands and curled up in the corner of the prison carriage as if this could make her feel a little safer. A day ago, the convoy stopped briefly at a small town on the platform east of Fathon Port in Naka. During the stop, she figured out where she was. The information revealed by the guards indicated that the convoy was heading to the west end of the Evergreen Corridor, which was also the starting point of East Metz, Fathon. Earlier that day, she clearly heard the sound of waves crashing against the cliff. She had walked through this mountain path more than once, but at that time, she came here as the daughter of a duke. Vahina leaned weakly against the cold iron wall. Strands of blonde hair hung down on her pale cheeks. She lowered her eyelids weakly, her thick eyelashes trembling slightly. The sound of seagulls could be heard outside the prison carriage. Strangely, the road was a little deserted. There was no sound of caravans passing by. In theory, this should be an important land and sea hub in East Metz. There was an endless stream of caravans on weekdays. Or perhaps Rodney did not plan to go to Fathon Port, but they had built a secret anchorage nearby. The girl suddenly felt a chill down her spine. These people were actually so cautious. However, that was not the case. The sun had just dispersed the fog between the straits, but the cliffs near the sea were still shrouded in a thin layer of water vapor. There was a pass in the middle of the misty water vapor. Rodney quickly stopped the convoy and looked up at the soldiers with anchor-shaped emblems on their battle robes on the city wall. The pass built by the mountains and the sea was the outermost line of defense of Fathom Port. Usually, the gate was rarely closed, but today, it was tightly shut. It seems that the war started by His Majesty has already affected this place. News of the Civil War had not yet reached these parts east of Metz, Rodney thought, but as the Queen's emissary he had first-hand information. He raised his head and shouted, "Open the door. Who are you people?" The soldier on top of the city gate tower poked his head out to ask. "We are from the White Legion. Our commander has urgent military matters to attend to at Fathom Port. I've already sent someone to inform you earlier. Didn't you see it?" The knight beside Rodney asked in annoyance. There was a commotion among the soldiers on the city gate tower, as if they were sizing them up to confirm their identities. This scene made Rodney even more certain of his thoughts. Usually, these people were not so loyal to their duties. The so-called inspection was mostly to deal with the situation or to take advantage of the situation to gain some benefits. After a while, the people on the city gate tower seemed to have confirmed the identities of Rodney and his entourage. After all, Rodney's retinue was a real White Legion knight. They were riding on tall mountain land dragons. The land dragons were also wearing special armor with silver scales on their bodies. On the saddle hung a war flag with the white dragon emblem. Their spears shone brightly, and they looked dignified. At a glance, one could tell that they were not fake goods. Soon, the city gate creaked as it rose. In the darkness, Vahina felt the cage shake slightly, and the convoy began to move forward again. She was still unaware of the battle that was happening in the east. She was slightly puzzled. Didn't these people bring her to the secret port? Why would there be a pass and a city gate? Even Fathom Port did not have such strict security. Brando, Eugenie, the Roman and the Shire were on the lookout tower, watching the convoy cross the drawbridge and pass through the city gate. Brando pointed at the knight at the front and introduced him to the other three. "That man is Rodney, Veronica's younger brother. He is the youngest son of Duke Arizik. However, this man is not very capable. At most, he is a jester." After Lady Veronica was put under house arrest by the Silver Queen, this man drew a line with his family and won the Queen's favor. Now, he is the Queen's secret envoy. The Arizik family is full of heroes. I didn't expect them to produce such trash. The Duke's daughter wrinkled her nose in disdain. You can't say that. This guy's ability to judge the situation and place righteousness before family is evident. He's just making the best use of everything, the Shire replied with a smile. My lord, you seem to be very familiar with this man. Brando did not comment on this question. In fact, as a player of Erewhon, he was quite familiar with the well-known figures of the enemy. However, this was not the only reason why he was familiar with this man. In history, Rodney was just like what the Shire said. He was famous for being good at taking advantage of the situation. His reputation made him like a fish in water in the upper circle of the Empire's nobles. At that time, people called him the twin pillars of the Arizik family. He and his sister Veronica were regarded as the pillars of the Arizik family. But no one knew that this man was a complete coward. In the War of the Year 41, Madara's army besieged White Eagle Fort, located in present-day Ludwig. He surrendered without a fight and sacrificed himself to the enemy, causing the White Legion to be almost wiped out. This was a famous scandal in the history of the Empire. Because of this incident, the prestige of the Arizik family plummeted. Even Veronica was implicated by him and was removed from the position of Legion commander. Therefore, it was difficult for players from the future to not be familiar with this famous traitor's deeds. However, this weak and incompetent man was a perfect example of a useless teammate. But if he was an enemy, he was really lucky. Fortunately, this guy's reputation was not well known now. Perhaps even the Silver Queen did not know what kind of person her new secret envoy was. The enemy's misfortune was his own great fortune. Brando thought that the Shire was right about one thing. If used properly, this man in front of him would not only be a big fish, but also a fat one. He looks quite decent. He's just a little bit worse than my Brando. The merchant lady's perspective was different from ordinary people. She squinted for a while before coming to this conclusion. Cough, cough, cough. Brando was almost choked to death by these words. What did she mean by look decent? The Arixico family had excellent genes. His sister Veronica was a famous beauty in the imperial capital when she was young. Rodney himself had perfectly inherited this bloodline and was one of the most famous gigolos in the imperial capital. He was also an expert at picking up girls. It was said that he had an ambiguous relationship with many of the famous ladies in the imperial capital. In terms of appearance, Brando knew that he would never be able to catch up with Rodney. Perhaps only the Roman people would be able to shamelessly boast like this. He looked at the two people beside him in annoyance. As expected, he saw the Duke's daughter looking at him with a strange expression. The unscrupulous wizard servant was also having a hard time holding back his laughter. Laugh if you want. Be careful not to get internal injuries from holding it in, Brando said calmly. That won't be necessary. He, my lord, the Shire laughed and said, there are still people below. It won't be good if we attract their attention. Eugenie had a strict upbringing and quickly restrained her emotions. She clenched her fist and coughed softly. I heard that Her Majesty sent him to spy on the White Legion. Why would he suddenly appear here? Who's inside the cage? You hit the nail on the head, the Shire smiled and said, there's a mermaid inside. Mermaid? The Duke's daughter frowned. That's just a metaphor. The little beauty in the cage is actually the Lord's old lover, Wah. The Shire screamed and dodged Brando's sword. My lord, you actually attacked. Those people are still below, shut up. Brando coldly replied. In fact, he had already guessed who was inside the cage the moment he saw Rodney. Vahina had written a letter to him, and it clearly expressed her intentions. In fact, Brando had already expected that she would be in trouble, but the young lady had underestimated the problem. The fact that the Silver Queen had placed Veronica under house arrest and chose to support Rodney as the next head of the Arixico family was enough to explain many things. Rodney would never help Vahina out of respect for his sister, not to mention that he was a despicable person from head to toe. Unfortunately, it was too late for him to reply to Vahina. He did not expect that Rodney would fall into his trap after capturing Vahina. In fact, Brando had also wronged Vahina. The Silver Queen had sealed off information from the east and north much more strictly than the south. That was why Vahina did not receive any first-hand information, just like how she did not know about the conflict of interests between the Arixico family and the Silver Queen. Brendel watched silently as the carriage passed through the pass and entered the port. His heart was secretly filled with a trace of anger that was difficult to detect. No matter what, Rodney's actions had crossed his bottom line. The carriage finally boarded the ship. Rodney breathed a sigh of relief as he looked at the bustling scene in front of him. In fact, he was well aware of his status. In terms of ability, he could not compare to his sister. In terms of popularity, he was no match for the military nobles in the north. However, he was sufficiently loyal to His Majesty, and he had no qualms about placing himself in the position of a sycophant. Since he had already established his position, he had to help His Majesty with some things under the table. Not only did he have to do it, he had to do it well and not leave any traces behind. Just like what he did this time. Of course, he knew that he would offend a lot of nobles, but it was better for him to be the villain than for His Majesty to be the villain, because His Majesty would remember his contribution. As for the nobles who were past their prime, he did not care if he offended them. He knew very well what Her Majesty wanted to do. It was a great undertaking that was not inferior to the 4 wise ones. No, it was far better than what the 4 wise ones had done. Those decadent and ancient nobles would be burned to ashes in the new flames. It was the same for the Arihiko family. Rodney said to himself in his heart. He had no qualms about what he had done. It was a matter of course that he had to give up something in order to gain something. Thinking of this, he looked back at the prisoner carriage that was about to be transferred to the lower deck. He knew very well the value of the young lady in the cage. Although Her Majesty had taken action in advance and established a new doctrine on the ruins of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, she did not want to overturn the entire empire. Although the nobles in the north had been proven to be completely unreliable, there were still more nobles who were watching. Her Majesty had once told him how important the nobles in the east of Metz were. If they turned to the new doctrine, Ludwig and the other old fogies would be in a difficult situation. Not to mention, East Metz was the main route to the Al-Kash Mountains. Although he did not quite understand why Her Majesty valued the Alcala region so much, East Metz must be in her hands in order to enter the Alcala region. Among them, the most important chess piece was the Flowerleaf territory. The current head of the Flowerleaf territory was the Duke of Flowerleaf, Helix. He was a hardliner and was emotionally biased towards Ludwig and the other nobles. When he was young, he had lived in the Arihiko family for a long time and had a deep relationship with the previous Duke of Arihiko. Therefore, he would definitely not be biased towards Her Majesty. The 2 sons of the Duke of Flowerleaf were also representatives of the military nobles. The stubborn local faction was even more untrustworthy. Lastly, the eldest daughter of the Duke of Flowerleaf, Vahina, was extremely rebellious and was also the disciple of the Azure Sword Saint. These people were not suitable candidates. Now that the Duke and his 2 sons were under house arrest, and the young lady was secretly escorted back to the capital. The remaining little princess was known as the Little Angel of the Flowerleaf territory. She had been timid and obedient since young. With her father, brother, and sister as hostages, there was no need to worry about her disobedience. Once the Flowerleaf territory turned to the Queen, East Metz would basically be half pacified. The remaining nobles who were weaker would most likely not wait and see anymore. As for the return of the Myernas, Rodney was a little disdainful. This world belonged to the Myernas in the first place, and the Iron People had only stolen the authority. Her Majesty the Queen was doing the right thing, and that was to put the authority back in its rightful place. And she would be crowned as the Dark Dragon as a Cruz citizen. When that time comes, the empire that ruled the land would reappear, and the people of Cruz would be on equal footing with the Myernas. It was laughable that some people did not understand. This was a righteous cause. Vahina felt cold and hungry. For the past 2 days, she felt that the people outside were watching the prison van more closely. In the past few days, she still had time to breathe, but for the past 2 days, the people outside rarely opened the door of the prison van. Even the number of times they sent food and water had decreased. They would only send food and water once a day in the evening, which made her feel wronged and scared. In fact, Vahina faintly understood that it was because they were almost at their destination. That was how humans were. Whenever something was nearing completion, they would become increasingly nervous and highly focused in order to avoid failing at the last step. It also meant that she was not far from facing her own fate. This thought made her feel uneasy. She did not know what she would face. Would she be executed directly in secret, taken as a hostage, or used as a chess piece in a political marriage? She had heard of such things many times in the past, but none of them were the main characters. She only felt that it was a little scary. But today, she felt a great uneasiness gripping her, and she could not breathe. It was as if she saw a path that led to a dark abyss, filled with blood and despair. Vahina shivered as she snuggled against the cold iron wall. The past kept replaying in her mind. At that time, she was still the high and mighty princess of Floral Hill, deeply loved by her father and his majesty. No matter where she was the center of everyone around her. Then, she became Veronica's student and went to many places with her teacher. She once breathed in the air of freedom and could no longer live in a cage. She once thought that she was different from the noble ladies who were like canaries. They were weak and could only accept the fate of others, but she, who was like a young eagle, could choose her own future. Reality proved her naivety. All her fantasies turned into bubbles. She felt as if she had been deceived by hope, and then mercilessly abandoned. Tears dripped onto the floor like beads of a broken necklace. Vahina cried helplessly. As she cried, Vahina recalled the days in the loop of trade winds. It was her first adventure away from the Empire, and she once thought that it was the most terrifying experience she had ever encountered in her life. A despicable country bumpkin not only humiliated her, but also taught her a lesson several times. Even His Excellency the Legion Commander could do nothing about him. But compared to what she was experiencing now, it was not even worth mentioning. She even felt a faint warmth when she recalled it now. If only I could go back to that time. Vahina was quickly shocked by her own thoughts, and soon fell into lamentation over her current predicament. Brando, Vahina was a little feverish. Her scalding forehead was pressed against the cold iron wall, and her mind could not help but wander. It was as if these wild thoughts could dispel the worries in her heart. She suddenly remembered that Brando had already arrived in the Empire and was just a stone's throw away from her, but he definitely did not know about her current predicament. Perhaps he still thought that she could help him and save his subordinates. But now, as the daughter of a duke who was once high and mighty, she could not even protect herself. Her future and fate were unknown. Perhaps she would die tomorrow, or perhaps she would drag out an ignoble existence that was worse than death. Oh, that girl called Vahina. I once went on an adventure with her when I was young, but it's a pity that I haven't heard anything about her for a long time. Oh, that girl called Vahina. I went on an adventure with her when I was young, but it's a pity that I haven't heard anything about her for a long time. Vahina's heart felt like it was being stabbed by a knife when she thought of this, and her eyes turned gloomy. Brando soon received news that Laudney's flagship had left the port. Just as he expected, Laudney did not even meet Baron Metz in order to keep it a secret. Being so cautious could be considered a skill. This also allowed Laudney to escape. Otherwise, once they entered the castle, Brando would order the net to be pulled back, and Laudney would not be able to escape even if he had wings. Now, he could only use the backup plan, which was to have the fleet stationed at the outer sea stop Laudney's flagship. It was not that he did not consider detaining Laudney in the port, but he had just taken over the port and had not dispelled the suspicion of the lower and middle officials in the port. It would be unwise to cause trouble at this time. Moreover, Earl Alcon had not decided to completely stand against the Silver Queen. At this critical moment, Brando was afraid of alerting the enemy, so he had no choice but to arrange the battle at sea. However, he was not afraid that Laudney would be able to escape. The warship that Rodney prepared was one of the fastest warships in the Empire's navy. Unfortunately, with such a conspicuous warship docked at the port, it was hard for the people of Aween to not notice it when they took over the port. Marjorie immediately reported this conspicuous warship to Seal. Navy warships rarely acted alone, especially this kind of fast warship. They were usually used to send messages or carry out some special mission. They quickly followed the clues and found out the traces of the messenger that Rodney sent to Fatine Port. In fact, it was through this method that they found out about the information about the convoy. Therefore, Brando had already arranged for someone to tamper with the ship. The quality of the magic crystal used as the floating warship's power source was changed, and some of the spare sails were removed. Laudney was in a hurry to leave the port, so he did not check it carefully. In fact, he did not think to check it because the warship had been docked at the port. Who would cause trouble for the Imperial Navy? And all of this had already doomed his ending. 3 Bugha floating warships with red sails disguised as Imperial patrol ships had left the port early and were waiting for Laudney's flagship in the outer sea. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.